Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna do some opening now, so we don't take Yuname's time. So okay, hi everyone. I'm one of the organizer, Ping Yu Chen from IBM Research. So you are attending the second workshop at KDD for Adversarial Learning Methods for Machine Learning and Data Mining. So it's unfortunate that we couldn't meet in person and have a physical workshop at San Diego, but no, it's also a blessing that we can really leverage our technology and through Zoom and through YouTube to make our workshop more inclusive. So you are seeing now is the workshop agenda for ADV ML 2020. So we have a great set of keynote speakers and also best paper award presentations. So started by Dr. Uname O'Reilly from MIT, followed by Dr. Kamalika Chahuri from UCSD, and also Dr. Chen Gu from UCLA. And then at 11 a.m., we will have two best paper presentations. One it will be given live. The other will be given in a pre-recorded fashion. And then we will use the remaining time to do some breakouts and make sure you have the chance to explore the presentations of other accepted papers. So now we are on top of the hour. So I will hand this host to Xijia Liu, who will introduce Dr. Uname.
Okay, thanks, Ping. Hello, everyone. I'm Xijia Liu. I'm one of the organizers of the workshop. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Uname O'Reilly, and Uname is the leader of the Any Skill Learning for All group at the MIT Computer Science and AI Lab. So Uname's research group focuses on scalable machine learning, evolutionary algorithms, large-scale knowledge mining, and artificial adversarial intelligence related to cybersecurity and so on and so forth. So Uname has received many awards. She received the Evolutionary Computation Star Award for outstanding achievements in evolutionary computation in Europe. So recently, ACM Special Interest Group on Genetic and Evolutionary Computation elected Uname for career recognition for scientific merit. She has also authored over 150 academic papers. So today, Uname will present her work related to artificial adversarial intelligence. And welcome again. And Uname, please feel free to start.
Thanks, Xijia. I'm going to share my screen with my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, and I want to just verify with someone, maybe one of the organizers can tell me if they're seeing like a full slide on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I can't see anyone, which is a shame, and I wish I was there in person. And I actually can't see myself. So that's normal. And I wanted to start this morning by thanking the workshop organizers. It's been an extraordinary year to be an organizer of any academic event. And I especially like the way they've handled this with such aplomb. And I am, looked at the program, and it's an impressive array of work and speakers this morning that I look forward to. So let me start. I wanted to tell you about my work on adversarial machine learning. And this is an agenda that my entire group is engaged in. And to start, I'm going to show you a white box attack. It's part of a framework named Sleipnir. And it really was our introduction to adversarial attacks on statistical models. And prior to that, and even I'm present, my group works on cybersecurity, right, and machine learning. So we think a lot about adversarial attacks. We think a lot about adversarial learning. And this was our first step into the arena where we were thinking about attacks on our detectors. And Sleipnir is then led us to think about black box attacks and how to craft a very efficient one. So I'm going to share with you an attack we call Sign Hunter. Both of these works, Sleipnir and Sign Hunter, are very standard in the forum of work that's being exhibited here today. But I know there's also a broader set of work here today. And so I wanted to also do that. I wanted to broaden my perspective on the work and your perspective on my work to, be beyond this taste of the adversarial example efforts, which are still ongoing. So we have, I'm working with CIGIA, and we're looking at code malware and how to attack that and how to make robust code models. But I wanted to round out that whole notion of adversarial examples and attacks with this idea that we're also interested in adversarial learning in the paradigm of GANs. So I want to tell you about a system called Lippinzaner. And then, because I don't really want you to run away and think, oh, I should read all of Uname's papers, the very artful papers that come out of my group. What I'm trying to do is really set the stage, not just for today, but really for this really nascent subfield that's growing and quite important around adversarial learning, by sort of giving my broader take on it with what I label to be an agenda of artificial adversarial intelligence. So we all know that, if we want to think about adversarial attacks on statistical models, we can characterize them sort of in three ways. Each kind of attack is focused on a different part of the machine learning workflow. So data poisoning is a training attack. And over here on the right, model stealing occurs after the models have been deployed. And finally, where I'm going to focus today is on adversarial examples, which are, as we all know, very modest, imperceptible perturbations to model inputs that change the model's decision to from being correct on an input to being incorrect on the perturbation. Well, there are a variety of techniques that generate adversarial examples, and one efficient and widely used one that I'm sure you're all familiar with is the fast gradient sign method. So just to put us all on the same page, with respect to an input, the method finds the directions that move the outputs of a neural network the greatest degree, and moves the inputs along those directions very small amounts with perturbations. Because the techniques reference gradient-based techniques reference the model's parameters and gradient, they're known as white box attacks. And when I got started looking at white box attacks, it was a hot area already, and there were a number of white box attacks and techniques to make models robust to them. And they assume different setups. And while they use different data sets, they were largely operating on models that assume that X, the input, is continuous. And we're going to draw on one of these white box methods for one of these resilience algorithms for white box attacks. And that's the one of Madry et al. In 2017. It's a saddle point optimization approach that allows the current, that while you're training against a good candidate, you're also finding good candidates, right? So way back when this started, we were just fascinated by these image-based adversarial examples. They're so intuitively crafty, because you can see them with the naked eye. But to layer another context of adversarial attack on it, our attention was actually focused on security. We were concerned with models that foil attackers by detecting malware, right? And we're really asking, how badly would our malware detection models succumb to evasion attacks? What evasion rate will an adversarial method achieve on our models? And what could be done to make malware detection models robust to adversarial examples? So to examine this, let me just give you some background, because I think I'm bringing a perspective of, I'm someone in security, I'm using machine learning, and now I have to think about an attack on my models. So what we do is the instance we looked at was portable executable files, which are characterized typically by the apps that run on your cell phone. These can be, the apps on your cell phone can become infected with malware. And we sourced about 35,000 malicious portable executables. and roughly 20,000 benign portable executables. We labeled them by using like a public online virus, a public online service where the commercial vendors supply a sort of a less than secret sauce recipe, but they are all ensembled together for us to get back detection labels. And we just made sure that when we took our examples that we collected, we ran them through VirusShare, and we made sure that, if there was, to consider that a file was benign, it didn't have any, it was not malicious, it had to have 0% detections from VirusShare. And to be malicious, over half the detectors within VirusShare had to say it was malicious. So we have this labeled data. It's binary. So what do we do next? Well, what we do is very standard. We distill features. And in this case, we really want to know how that piece of code is executing. So one way to do that is you can actually extract from the binary with a program, a list of a feature vector, something you're going to use as a feature vector. And what it is it's a list of all the API functions that the binary calls, and there's a 1 or a 0 for each of those functions, depending on whether or not it's called. So there's about 23,000 ones of these bit sets, and you can assemble a feature vector. And then what you're really getting is something sort of saying like, there's a pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior can be discerned by looking at the combinations of API functions this particular binary calls. That's the intuition beneath those features, and then we use a feed-forward neural network as our malware classifier. It's got 3 hidden layers of 300 neurons each. And we're using ReLU activation functions at the neurons. We use a log softmax at the end to get a binary detection, and we implement a model in PyTorch, and this presumably is something that you could use later on observations from the field that you would distill the features for and then get a detection label for them. So how well does that model perform? Well, we call that the natural model, and it does pretty well. We think it gets a academically passable accuracy, and bearing in mind that we really care about these false positive and false negative rates, because a false positive rate means that someone using the model is now going to go to the painful is going to be told something is actually malicious and it's not, which just costs them more time to figure that out. And then the false negatives are actually more concerning, which is this idea that a piece of code passes through the detector and it's actually malicious. And these results I'm just showing you on the sort of standard test portion we keep out. They're very standard. So the question we want to next ask is like, how do we get adversarial examples that are going to attack this model, right? And the extra malware-specific challenges that lie here are that it's not like images where you have to imperceptibly change a pixel value, or set up a mask which is going to allow the appearance to be the same. Here, you can't break the malware, or you can't even break the app, because if you do any of those things create an adversarial example, it's never going to get run, right? So that's one of the sort of new constraints that comes in from being in this field. And the answer to that actually is quite apparent from the feature vector. What we can do is we can make sure that when we craft adversarial examples, we're going to flip those bits. In other words, we're going to take a bit that says this API function wasn't called, and we can flip it to say it was called. But we're never going to flip it to say it was not called when it was. And because that would presumably result in the binary being broken. And then the second challenge to get these adversarial examples is that we have to work on the binary space itself, which is discrete. We don't have the same choices we would have in a continuous input space. So the first attack I'm going to show you is one we call, it's a fast gradient sign method knockoff, with the k-steps. What we do is we have to be able to perturb and move in binary space, right? So what we do is we just do FGSM, and then we truncate or round. And we can do that with either a random threshold, the rounding, or we can do that with a fixed threshold that we use throughout learning. And that gives us two different, two basically the same, but two variations on this notion that we're going to round off the gradient, the perturbation as a result of chasing the gradient. And I'm just going to talk about the randomized one now because it performs better than the deterministic one. The other thing we can do, though, is to remember that FGSM is in continuous space, right? And the adversarial examples are generated by moving stepwise, within this sort of epsilon ball around the image, right? But in contrast, what's going on here is when you craft an adversarial candidate, you're kind of sitting at the vertices of a binary feature space. So instead of sort of multi-stepping through the continuous space and rounding, the other thing you can do is you can just use the gradient and sort of set the bit if the corresponding partial derivative has a high magnitude relative to the rest of the bits in the vector, right? So if you look over here on part A, say we have a 3-dimensional feature vector and it's 1, 0, 0, we can either flip the second bit, flip the third bit, or flip both of them, right? And if we start, though, from a point that's 0, 1, 1, then we can only flip the first bit, right? So this tells us sort of the perturbation space. But what we can do now is we can sort of, on the first flip, before we do the first flip, we can sort of look at those gradients and we can decide which direction we're going to head. And then at the new point, after we take those, after we do the flip, we can look at the gradient again and make another flip in the direction of the gradient. But we're doing this with bit flips. So we call this a bit gradient ascent perturbation, right? So if you look at these attacks on a natural model, they're devastating. The old accuracy just disappears and you get this incredibly high false negative rate, regardless of which one of these attacks you use. So it's devastating to the model, and yet it seems fairly straightforward. So how are we going to move to a robust model? Well, for this, we're going to use the saddle point in SleepNear. We use the saddle point optimization formulation, which is just like Madry of 2017. The typical training objective, remember, of a model is going to be, a set of parameters that minimizes the model loss. But in this formulation with saddle point optimization, we're going to actually make the minimization over the adversarial maximization of the loss. And to some extent, if you squint a little carefully, you can claim that Danskin's theory gives this a foundation theoretically, because it's sort of saying that the saddle point properties of the loss landscape are such that you'll be able to, when you train, converge optimally. And the key sort of aspect of this, of using this min-max saddle point optimization from our perspective, is that we can incorporate both the adversarial example collection design and collection at the same time as we can, at the same time as we're training, and then we can flip them around and also use them in training to do the hardening. So we're kind of like finding the current discriminatory boundary, finding adversarial examples that could cross it, are likely to cross it because we know the gradient there, and then we're flipping them right around to retrain and move the discriminatory boundary so that it's robust to those perturbations that we've seen. Okay, and that's essentially brings us to the algorithm, right? And I'm just going to provide the big picture here, but we take the training set and we split it into malicious and benign, and then we select one of these perturbation methods. And then at each training epoch, starting from the current model parameters, the algorithm runs like an inner maximization, where it basically perturbs examples until it finds ones that maximize the loss in the model. And it collects these, and then we add those back to the training set and collect them offline as well. And then we train on them again with an outer minimization that will now train on the original training set plus the adversarial examples. And if you wanted to know more information on that, the paper's written there, but let me show you some of the results. So we get models that are performing as well, which is what we really needed to be able to do. But what we find is that, depending on the way in which we've looked for the adversarial examples when we're training and incorporating them, we get this trade-off between a higher or a lower false positive and false negative rate. So it's not a completely solved problem, you know, and you know, to transition this algorithm to a more realistic setting is going to take a little bit more work. But we can also look at the evasion rates against the trained models. And these are when, you know, we're using a 50, you know, a step size of 50, a K of 50. And we would expect the sleep near models to be most robust to adversarial examples collected during their training, right? So we framed those along the diagonal. And then we took the models. We know that the models corresponding to the cells in bold here are the most robust models with regard to the corresponding adversary. So we really expected the diagonal and the bold to match. And what's kind of interesting emerging from here is that this randomized method for looking for adversarial examples is also going to produce for us the most robust model to adversarial examples, even from attacks that are, you know, based on our the bitwise gradient descent or the bitwise coordinate ascent. We also have shaded cells, and they correspond to the adversaries with the most successful, the models with the most successful most successful adversaries with regard to the corresponding model. So you can see those as well, right? And so across the top, you're sort of saying, you know, if I'm the natural model, I read across here, when I'm attacked by the adversarial examples that I've got collected from randomized finite gradient sign method, then, you know, the evasion rate is very, very high. So we really want that evasion rate to be low. And what we find is we're, you know, finding that really sort of quite robustly for the randomized, the model that has been robustified with the randomized method across the board. So that's a fairly nice result and conforms to the sort of expectations we could get from the underlying theory. And if you want more information, we have some code and info for you somewhere. And now let me go quickly to the black box attack that we've worked on. And here, you know, as you may know, the assumption is that we can't see the model. We don't have any access to the gradient, but we're going to assume that there's a oracle we can call that's going to give us the loss for any particular query we make with an input. And that the original input is X, and the new input is going to perturbed input is X prime. And our goal with the black box attack in our formulation is that we're trying to maximize the loss of the model given some limited number of queries to the loss oracle, right? And we have an algorithm, it's called Sign Hunter. And what's remarkable is that Sign Hunter can, you know, if you give it the standard challenge where there's, you know, you're given 10,000 MNIST images and you have a standard MNIST model, Sign Hunter achieves 100% evasion rate. And then when we take, you know, the current state-of-the-art attacks combined, and we look at standard models for MNIST, CFAR, and ImageNet, we get roughly 4 times less failure-prone attacks, and we use 2.5 times fewer queries. And this method actually has no hyperparameters, and it doesn't have any priors. So let me tell you about that. That should provoke your interest because it's so high performing and it's fairly simple. At the heart of these black box adversarial attacks is the gradient estimation problem. And we know that that means that the query complexity is going to be order n in an n-dimensional set of data features. And so what the community is doing at large basically is formulating a gradient estimation problem and solving that in this continuous optimization space by using a finite difference method, right? And once they do that, they're still in order n space, but what they can do is you know, take a look at priors, whether they're data dependent or time dependent over the course of the adaptation of the perturbation sequence, and then decrease n, right? So decrease the dimensionality, or you can try and transfer your results from another model that's equivalent, or you can take the GAN approach. But here we're going to directly model use the model. And here's a hint as to how we can go forward. Is it turns out that noisy signs, like so 70% of the signs being chosen randomly, are enough to achieve an error or an evasion rate of 70% on a model. So if you take this plot here, and we're showing how many MNIST coordinates are randomized, and we're looking at the, given that they're randomized, their misclassification rate, what we see is that you don't have to always get the sign right, and you can still get the evasion correct. And like if you get 70% of signs picked at random correct, you can get up to a 70% error rate, right? And so this turns out, we saw this result reported in a Madry paper. We went and replicated it for ourselves, and we went and took a look at CFAR10, and we looked at ImageNet, and we were seeing the same thing, right? That there was this hint that, you can choose different parts of the signs at random in this vector, and you'll get a high evasion rate. So that kind of led us to thinking about Hamming oracles, Hamming distance oracles, and so if you have a Hamming distance oracle, that's going to give you like the distance between your guess of the signs of the perturbation and the actual sign of the gradient at that moment, you can actually recover that sign, a vector of those gradient signs, in n over log n time. So that gives you a hint that you can do things faster than order n. So that's led us to sort of say, is it possible that we don't actually need a full gradient estimation with its full order n query complexity? Could we instead just estimate the signs and still get, and get some sort of lower query complexity empirically, and effective attacks, or attacks as effective as those on the full gradient? So we formulated a problem, and it would be one of minimizing the Hamming norm, which is equivalent to maximizing the directional derivative for the directional derivative. So that's how we went forward. We kind of used properties of the directional derivative for these sign vectors. And I'm going to approximate the directional derivative here by a finite difference in losses with respect to the example and the probe I'm using to recover the gradient sign info from the model, right? And from the definition of that directional derivative, you can transform this sort of like one single n-dimensional optimization problem into n one-dimensional optimization problems. So now what can you do with that? Well, you can start to make comparisons, right? You can take two queries, and let's assume they're exactly the same in the blue portion of their vectors. But the portion that remains, query 1 has all the correct signs and query 2 doesn't. You know from this that the directional derivative of query 1 is going to be higher or equal to the directional derivative of query 2, right? So that's getting you a hint of how you can use the directional derivative and the sign properties. So let's say what we start and we say, okay, we're going to make an initial guess and query the oracle and get back the directional derivative with the loss. And what we can now do is we can just sort of say for this initial guess, we can just sweep down it one by one and keep flipping bits, right? And one at a time. And each time we flip a bit, we can look at the whether that quantity increases or not. We can retain the flip or we can flip it back. Right? And so this is an easy way of stepping down the vector and getting the signs right by looking at this, consulting this information and doing a comparison. The problem is that, of course, we're still back at n+1 queries, right? And there has to be something better because, if you have an initial guess and you think that half of them are right, you're wasting half the queries to find the rest of them, right? So you need to be able to do better. And what we did was we thought about, well, let's just assume that there's equal magnitudes to all of these partial derivatives. So now what we can do is, we can assume that the initial guess, query 1, has R correct sign bits and S wrong ones, and we can flip it, all of its sign bits all at once, and get its negation, which is query 2. And now we can take a look at the results result coming back from each of those two queries, and that will tell us that, in one go, how many sign bits we've recovered, right? And it's going to be the maximum of the correct signs in query 1 or the correct signs in query 2. So that means that you can sort of start thinking about this idea that you would split on successively different parts of the sign vector. So consider this example. This is my initial guess. I flip everything. And now I flip the first half. And all of a sudden I've got everything right. And that would take 3 queries just to recover the gradient sign vector. And so now we just, what's going on here is some sort of weighted voting from the choice between the 2 queries. And of course, we're sort of assuming the magnitudes are the same, but we'll come back to that assumption because we should double check it later. So pictorially, what the algorithm is doing is sort of taking a divide and conquer approach. It's going to guess, it's going to flip, it's going to choose. Then with the updated choice, it's going to divide and flip and choose. And then it's going to repeat to the other side and choose, and then divide again and divide and choose again. And this is still going to take order n at the worst case, but it may be the case that we'll find a solution that defeats the model before it finishes on average, right? And the adversary really only has to do this until the query deceives the model, right? So how can we be optimistic that this would actually not be worst case? Well, the first thing is that we can go back to that gradient assumption we were making about having equal magnitudes. And we went back and we looked at the data, and it turns out that if we took 1,000 images from, I think this is MNIST, and we looked at the gradient magnitudes and what they were on a histogram. And it turns out they are really, really concentrated. So as long as they're equal, we're getting really, we can do this sort of flipping and choosing in sort of like smaller and smaller chunks until we find an effective example. Pretty fairly. There's going to be one image that may be a problem, but most of them it's not going to be problematic, right? And we went and then we looked at CFAR and ImageNet, and we basically saw the same sort of histograms, so not necessarily as provocative as the first sample we got out of MNIST, but they're there. So the second thing to go back to is that first thing I showed you, which is that noisy signs, meaning like I don't have all of them right, they'll still be pretty good. They might be good enough to attack. Remember, these are the things that we were talking about before. These 30% of the sign bits being correct was enough to achieve a 70% misclassification rate. So this method may actually, in a sense, succeed without being perfect. And it may succeed given some assumption that the magnitudes are concentrated. And that's basically the basics of the algorithm. I've sort of shown it to you, and let me show you how it works. We made great use of this Madry Labs challenge where they have like a naturally trained model and they say, here's 1,000 images, can you attack it? And we looked at state of the art and looked at how many queries it takes to attack them, based on that budget of queries, what kind of loss would they be able to achieve on the model? And of course, high here is better because this is in the negative scale. You want to, and this is, you want to be higher is better here. The top of the y-axis is here. So if we look at all of those and then we add Sign Hunter is completely parameter free, and it very quickly beats them all on this challenge. We can also, look at the evasion rate for, MNIST and sort of look at how many queries we were using on average, and it turns out we're using 12. We can repeat for CFAR. Here you see with CFAR, we get another set of very positive results in terms of the success rate of the evasions, and that it being hit very quickly under very, very small budget limitations. And then, ImageNet, we couldn't quite use Madry's. So, sorry, we were able to do it here. But, the thing to remember is that like the distance between Sign Hunter isn't as great as the other methods have, as it was with the other data sets, which is interesting. But it's partly, I think, because we're searching over Sign Hunter searches over huge numbers of coordinates. And these other methods are actually, they've done like bandits, which is the second best method here. It's actually done dimensionality reduction. So, one would, there's a thought experiment there about, sign hunter on the bandit dimensionality reduced space. We also, Madry's challenge lab produced like a secret sort of robustified model and said, try and attack it. And so we took a look at, we ran all the submitted attacks on Madry's model. And, the model was still very, very accurate for many of them. And then we ran the sign hunter attack, and everyone was doing this with a budget, I think, of 5,000 queries. And sign hunter decreased the model accuracy the most of anyone of all of these algorithms. And if we gave it a few more restarts and steps, this is another condition, then we were getting down to like a sub 90% accuracy for the model. And then we repeated that for CFAR, and far exceeded others on CFAR. And also, when we went to look at ImageNet now, in terms of robust defense, we didn't have a robustified model from the Madry lab. So what we did was we, came up with an ensemble adversarial learning approach defense from Tramer et al. In 2018, and we looked at attacks on that. And with the clean data, that method has an error rate of 24%. But if you attack it with a white box, you're up at, its error rate increases. And if you sort of do it with a series of black box transfer attacks, this is people, they can sort of push the error rate down. The error rate, is not as good. But if you now add, sign hunter, and you give sign hunter 20 queries, it's almost achieving a white box error rate. And if you give it 1,000 queries, it's up there, it's basically defeated the model. The model's, only correct 10% of the time. So, this is an interesting algorithm. It seems like you don't need, in practice, the full gradient estimation, and you can get effective attacks. And so I'll just refer you to other work we have on this, which is more extensive. And now, I've done the sort of the typical thing that you're going to see done in the past. And I think the workshop work today will move us past these kinds of exercises. But I wanted to talk more broadly, and that's because I really do care about adversarial learning, right? And one of the places where in machine learning where we're also doing adversarial learning is with GANs, obviously, right? We have a minimax formulation here between the generator and the discriminator. And what we all know is that GAN training has pathologies, right? The modes collapse, we see mode collapse, we sometimes see non-convergence, sometimes we have a gradient that gets lost. And so our thought was when we saw this and we saw this adversarial learning sort of going awry, going off from the direction we wanted it to go in, what are we going to do about that? And I'm going to suggest something pretty provocative. And that's that we could look to biological arms races of adversarial, where there's adversarial learning, because those biological arms races where there's evolutionary learning actually generate pretty robust defenses and very effective attacks. And I'll give you an example of one. So here is a very effective attack that has been learned by nature. This hornet is not the attacker. The attacker is this yellow spider. Take a deep look, right? And it has evolved a camouflage that matches the flower so it can entrap the bee. And here's another example of an evolved defense, right? So the monarch butterfly doesn't taste very good, and that's its defense. That's been evolved. But what's co-evolved with the monarch butterfly is the viceroy butterfly on the right, and it has evolved a mimicry defense, right? And these are co-evolutionary learning going on between adversaries. Here is certainly in the case to the left, and in some case, the viceroy and the monarch are adversaries as well because they compete for the same environment. So our question was whether co-evolutionary algorithms that actually take inspiration from this biological co-evolutionary process that generates robust defenses and effective attacks, whether we could actually use them to improve the robustness in GANs. So to do that, we have a variety of work. But let me just review a basic evolutionary algorithm. It starts with a population of solution candidates. They're evaluated and ranked, and then by that evaluation fit, which we call a fitness score, the better ones are selected. They're varied according to some almost randomized context, their representation. And then we get a new generation through that evaluation, selection, and variation. And the algorithm, iterates and performs adaptation and learns in this way. So a co-evolutionary algorithm is now, I'm going to frame it by mapping it to GAN training, right? So imagine if we had a population of generators, and we have in a co-evolutionary algorithm, we can have a population of generators and we can have a population of discriminators. Those two populations now interact because we actually train every generator against every discriminator one at a time. And we take every discriminator and we train it against every generator one at a time. And now we have this notion of how good each one of those generators and discriminators are. And we have a sort of more robust number because it's being tested and trained under different conditions, right? And then we take their performance on the whole and independently select better ones in each population, independently change them, and then resort to new generators. And remember, what we've got in here is complete gradient-based training, right? But what we're wrapping the gradient-based training in is an evolutionary algorithm that allows a population-based approach to take place. And we can now actually carry along in the population-based approach hyperparameters like the learning rate. So we came up with a system that goes beyond just thinking about populations. So what I've drawn here is a generator and a discriminator. And imagine we put them inside a cell. And each one of these cells, this 3x3 array of cells, has a generator and a discriminator. We can now run a population-based evolutionary algorithm on each cell, but each cell has a different population. And that's because they're going to pick up a population from their north, south, east, and west. So if you look down here and we talk about the cell in the center, then the population consists of 2, 4, 6, and 8 cells. But if I think about training cell 1, it's going to pick up a population, because I treat this cell, this grid array, as a toroid, it's going to pick up population members 2, 3, 4, and 7, and there's some overlap, right? So now when each one of these cells independently does population all versus all learning, they're only doing it on a small population, but everyone's doing it, and they're communicating how well they do when they select their best parameters because they have overlapping neighbors, right? And that's the principle of the system, which we call Lipinzaner. And Lipinzaner is a spatially distributed co-evolutionary framework to train GANs with gradient-based optimizers, right? And because it's doing population-based training, it has faster convergence. It gets robustness from the fact that it's got the spatial mapping and co-evolution. It allows us to co-learn hyperparameters, and it gets a lot of diversity because of the effects of the cells being spread spatially. So in just one example, we can actually take these different cells and we can have them each randomly pick a loss function. And why would I do that? It's because when I want to train a GAN, I don't know which is the right loss function to do. So now if I take Lipinzaner, I can set it to randomly pick loss functions. And then when I train it, I get results that are as good as the best loss function that could be chosen. But I don't have to go through this search through all of them to find that. I can just run Lipinzaner to do that, right? And we can show that as well, because these learning is taking place across these cells on a grid, we get a better distribution of class coverage. The same thing happens whether we look at something small like MNIST, but then we also sort of pump up the results by looking at Soleve as well. So this is a system you can load. I just want to let you know it's an adversarial learning system that combines gradient-based training and evolutionary learning. And it's pretty user-friendly, and it lets you, as we move to generation 2, it's going to have all sorts of variants you might want for discriminators for GAN training. And as well, it's got sort of the advantages of doing things spatially distributed with populations. And there's lots of that. So the reason I was doing that was sort of to just say, look, we have to think of adversarial learning from a very broad context. And here's as broadly as my group does this. You know, I essentially have this agenda, and it's called artificial adversarial intelligence. And I can stylize, you know, basically AI settings that are distinctive by particular properties. First and foremost, they feature these intelligent adversaries, right? And I study these competitors where they have conflicting objectives. And it means that, you know, when one engages, the other one will, you know, the outcomes are invertible, right? So the biggest assumptions you want to make, I want to make when I think about these adversaries and their stylization of the paradigm, is that they're intelligent and they're both capable of learning. So they have these objectives that are conflicting, but they know that if they engage, they will actually be able to collect data that helps them learn from experience. They will adapt based on that experience, and they'll come back. And that's something I think our community could think a bit more about, is that there's a dynamics to these adversarial attacks, and we're going to trigger arms races. And it's just as important to think now about the arms races as it is to think about the independent attacks, right? And this really comes from this assumption that our adversaries and us are both intelligent, and we're capable of learning at the same time. And we may find that in the wild, we see this sort of adversarial variation, and it plays out in all sorts of spheres. So to rushing to the end, you know, I'm suggesting that there's this topic called artificial adversarial intelligence. I mean, you can use two different kinds of machine learning approaches. You can use bio-inspired computation, like coevolutionary algorithms, because they're very well suited to the assumptions of adaptation and competitive coevolution. And you can use data-driven methods like deep learning and min-max optimization. And if you take those approaches, you can actually, as a group, my group is able to study, you know, malware detection with all sorts of different attacks on different kinds of malware. And we can look at GAN training and improving it with scalability, improving its robustness and scalability. And we can also start applying these same algorithms to network security and worry about in the phenomena that everyone's seeing in networks, which is that every time we make some sort of change to shore up our defenses, our attacker, because they're intelligent, comes back with something else. And so, you know, we want to have agendas. I'm advocating for agendas that include some portion of consideration to the dynamics that take place, because we assume that both sides are not static. And with that, I should end by showing you that I have this amazing research group here at MIT. They are handling the lockdown with such aplomb, and they all connect and work super hard. And I wanted to acknowledge how much work they've done. In particular, it's a postdoc, Abdullah Al-Dujaili, who has left the group and is working right now, who contributed Sleipnir and SignHunter. Jamal Tutu and Eric Hemberg were responsible for Lipinzaner, and other team members helped them. So with that, I'll take questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Yunami. Okay, yes, if we have any questions, we can either type in on the group chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask. Okay, maybe I can ask a further question. Mm-hmm. So for the SignHunter, you mentioned we do not need hyperparameters.
Yeah.
So, but if we still estimate the sum of the gradient, we still need some hyperparameter like step size to determine the.
We set the step sign to epsilon in the epsilon ball.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, because you want to stay in the sort of like in the coordinate space of the signs. Okay. So it becomes a binary. It's related to Sleipnir a bit, because we're really searching for signs, and we're in a binary space.
Okay, sense.
Yeah, that's a great question though.
Okay.
I think there's further work to be done on SignHunter, because we can kind of frame the theory. We can frame it sort of with a lower bound. We have some work done, and you can find it in our archive report. and I think in the appendices of the iClear paper, where we look at how we can, we know that it's going to be bounded below by FGSM, and we know we kind of can bound it above because we know sort of the cost of that doing. We have some proofs from some limits from the Hamming Oracle work.
I see. Thanks. Okay. Any more questions?
I had a question actually.
Sure.
Thanks. So this is more general, but what do you or how successful are the adversarial attacks and like gradient estimation across all different types of models? Are they like different? Do they vary from say like one-shot learning type models for like face recognition, as someone might put in a public space, or are they pretty much similar, I guess, in performance? Don't know if that's
are you talking about black box attacks or white box attacks?
Black box attacks.
Yeah, right. Because what we're trying to do with the black box attack is estimate that gradient, right? And so we're given this query budget, and I'm wondering whether there's something very very specific to the characteristics of images, right? So we certainly found that those once we trained those image models, we found that concentration of the magnitudes, right? And I don't know if that holds for other domains. First of all, for the data sets, and then of course that it's both the data and the model that you train that go together. So I think that's an open question, and I think that really would be very interesting to see. That's one condition, and I think then the other thing that we were concerned about was, is it the case always that if we just get a certain number of sign bits right, we'll pass through the evade? And there again, I think that you've asked about different kinds of models, and I would say it's some combination of the model and the data as well going on here. So I think the caveat is your mileage may vary, but I think it's really worth some effort to look at. We in a perfect world, we'd set up another challenge like we had last year and say, well, here's this black box attack. Can you give us a data set or a model that it can't attack well?
Thank you.
Great question.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, so this is Pinyo. So I first want to make a comment that I want to thank Unamaze Group's contribution. So last year, also at the ADB/ML, Abdullah actually hosted a challenge, a robustness challenge. So we have an attack track and defense track, and the results are very interesting. And he has done a very insightful analysis. Yeah. So and then follow up, I have a question. So I know Unamaze Group, you have focused a lot on like a malware, like a detection and evasion, right? So do you see fundamental difference, right, for malware compared to other types of data, right? Because essentially, I think all the data can be represented as a binary strings, right, somehow. So do you see, I mean, why you are rather focus on malware? So any fundamental difference?
That's a great question. So I think that there's one category of malware, which is the input representations are discrete and they're binary, right? So that's what we kind of dealt with the white box attacks. But I think what's really where we're all working with and which Sijia is working with us on as well, is I'm concerned about malware that appears inside source code. So there are scripts that everybody can run, that can be run on your computer almost without your knowledge, right? So if you load, if you go into Excel, someone could have put a script in there that you can run on your machine. Or when your sysadmin comes around and Microsoft wants to update all of the software on network, and your sysadmin gives them access, then PowerShell is used. It's a language that goes and sort of runs in source code level, it's called fileless because there's no file needed to change all your settings. And so there's all this source code that could be maliciously manipulated. So first of all, building detectors for those are really hard. Is it a language problem? And can we use strictly natural language detectors? No, the coding community is learning that we have to build sort of code to sequence type models for them, but then we have to think about attacks on those code to sequence models. And so we do have an active project where we're thinking about, what does it mean to attack a model that's been trained to detect code-based malware. And so I think that, when you think of it from a security perspective, it's really where are the, where is someone attacking you? What do we do as a machine learning modeling approach to detect that? And then that particular detector, we have to look at whether it's going to be adversarially attacked. And I think what I really could learn from this workshop too is to more broadly understand, what does it mean to poison malware, to poison the data when it's training, and you take the case where it's a program that's the training data, right? You're going to start with program as a training data. You might change it to an AST, an abstract syntax tree, and then you may extract some pieces of information from that syntax tree. Anywhere along the line, what is the most effective data poisoning for that model? So for me, from a security perspective, I've sort of shifted my interest in binaries to code because it's so complex.
I see. Thank you.
Okay.
I should
Other
probably
questions?
stop sharing the screen, right?
Yeah, you can. Any other questions before we switch to next speaker? Okay. Yeah, if you have any further questions, you can leave on the.
Oh, so actually there are some questions on YouTube. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you can
okay,
share.
so the first question is how much is training overhead when we train again using a deep learner method compared to traditional approach?
And by the way, Ping, can you also copy and paste on the group chat?
Okay. Yeah, so the first question is asking the training cost of the deep learner method compared to traditional approach.
Okay, sorry, the training cost of Lippenzaner. So it's hard to, we calculate it. So one is it seems more expensive because we're doing this on a 3x3 cells. We go as large as 4x4 and 5x5. Not very rarely 5x5. We don't really want to do 25, 25 at once. And we are incurring some cost, but what we're doing is getting to robust solutions faster, right? So it's not a free lunch, right? As soon as you say you're going to train against multiple models, it's more costly. But you're not training every model against every other model. You're only training in populations of 5, right, over here. So we definitely have to some extent, justify the cost by the fact that we can get not just more robust training, but we get models that are much better at covering the space. We get models that are, we can easily find which is the best loss function to have used and things like that.
Okay. So Ping, should we move to next speaker?
Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you, Yunwei.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's
yeah, Ping, can you make I think Kamalika is here, so
yeah. I didn't see her account. Okay. okay, cool. Yeah. So feel free to check the configurations.
Okay, let me try to share my screen.
yeah, thank you.
Let me try to okay, sorry, give me a second. Share screen. It says host disabled attendee screen sharing. So you have to enable or allow me to share the screen.
Yeah. So Ping, can you? I think
Yeah,
we need to make co-host.
Why is your account? Okay, I see you now. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, please try again. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So in the meantime, I think we can have a short break. So we will start right on time at 9 a.m. Yeah.
Okay, so the screen looks like it got shared and we'll start in a couple of minutes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Cho, I think we can get started.
Okay, yeah. So thank you. So we're very happy to have like Professor Chandri to give a talk in our workshop. So Professor Chandri is associate professor in UCSD, and she got several awards, including NSF Career Award and also Hellman Fellowship. And she was also the chair of ICL and AI Stats last year. Yeah, and she done a lot of work on differential privacy, and recently she's working on adversarial robustness. So her group is probably one of the first groups studying the robustness of like nonparametric models. So I guess it's will be in her talk today. So let's welcome Professor Chandri for her talk. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So I am kind of a theoretician by training. So what I will be talking about today, to some extent, is kind of the theoretical aspects of the problem. So so why things like why do we have adversarial robustness? Things like that, right? Okay. So I guess this is a workshop on adversarial examples, so I don't have to go ahead and introduce them. Basically, these are small perturbations to legitimate inputs that cause misclassification. And, this is kind of this famous picture of the panda. You add a tiny bit of perturbation and it's, and the neural network is very confident that it's a given, right? And the reason why we care about these things is that they have the potential to lead to serious safety issues. So for example, instead of a panda being misclassified as a given, if a stop sign got misclassified as an yield sign, that would be a really serious problem. Right. And so this is kind of the state of the art. The adversarial examples, this is kind of the state of the art. There are a very large number of attacks, including some by, some of the organizers of the workshop, right, by Chojui and his group. And they work extremely, extremely well. So there's a large number of attacks. There are quite a few defenses, for various things. A couple for deep learning. There are a few for other things as well. However, we don't quite understand quite so much what is going on with adversarial examples, right? So why do we see them? What's going on? Can we recover from them at all? Can we hope to recover from them at all without sacrificing accuracy? What's going on over there, right? And that is kind of what I will talk about today, right? So why do these adversarial examples happen? Okay, so let me start out with a background. So just to make the mathematically, just to make the setting clear. So let me start out with what our setting is, what we will be talking about. The background that we'll be talking about, we are setting things up in, is classification, right? So classification is, it's the simplest problem in machine learning, right? So when you open a machine learning textbook, this is literally the first thing that you see. You have, XY pairs. So your training data consists of a whole bunch of XI, YI pairs. Your XIs are feature vectors, and your YIs are some discrete labels, right? And what you want to do is you want to find some sort of a prediction rule in either belonging to a class or of a particular type that would predict the y's from the x's. So for example, your x's could be vector representations of images. So you take your image, you convert it into a vector. Yi's could be what is in the image, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to design a prediction rule that will take the image and give you what is in it, right? And we are talking about, and here we are talking about single labels, right? So we are not talking about multiple labels at all. So this is, one of the, basically if you open a machine learning textbook, this is the first thing that you see, right? So this is this is our setting. And what we will be working in is the statistical learning framework. Again, this is, the first thing that we see in our machine learning textbook. Right? So what does this framework say? The framework says that there is some sort of underlying data distribution D, right? So for example, if we are looking to classify images, there is some underlying distribution of images, right? So, you know, MNIST, for example, you can think about there's some underlying distribution of, images of handwritten digits, right? And both your training data and your test data is drawn independently from this underlying distribution D. Right. And, you know, this, it's not really true. I mean, it's not strictly true, right? I mean, in practice, it's not strictly true. But this is the kind of assumption under which, this is kind of the underlying assumption underlying a lot of machine learning. And it seems to work reasonably well because, our machine learning classifiers, at least they work reasonably well, right? So it comes from some underlying distribution D. And what we try to do, and, this is what we have tried to do in traditional machine learning, is to find a classifier F that will maximize accuracy on this distribution, right? So what do I mean by accuracy? Well, the accuracy is if you draw samples from this distribution, if you had an infinite number of samples from this distribution, and if you drew them, what is the fraction of the times where the label that fx predicts is the same as the label that you see, right? So this is, what is the fraction of times where if you drew pairs xi, yi, feature labels, what is the fraction of times where fx predicts the right labels, right? So this is accuracy. And this has kind of been the goal of traditional machine learning, right? I mean, this has basically been the goal of, most of the things that we do in machine learning, okay? So now what we want to do to this is add robustness, right? So how do we look at robustness? Well, we say that our classifier F is robust with a radius S at a point X if you have some distance metric D, right? And if when the distance between x and x prime is less than or equal to s, what you have is that f of x is equal to f of x prime, right? So what does this mean? It means is that if you have a data point x, right, for a distance, for a distance s around this data point, your classifier is going to predict the same label. If this happens, then your classifier is robust at x, right? So pictorially, if you look at those, the red and the gray points, and then if you look at those little balls around them, so here, pictorially, this blue classifier is robust because if you look at those red and the gray points, and if you look at those, kind of balls around them, it predicts the same thing in those balls. Right, so that's why it's robust. And again, if this happens, then we say that there are no adversarial examples around x, right? So an adversarial example is something that is within distance s of x, where the classifier is predicting a different label. Okay, so this is how we measure robustness, and this is how we define adversarial examples. Now, you might be asking, what is this metric? What is this distance d? Now, when you are defining robustness, this distance d could be anything. Most of the practical works, what people do is this distance is some sort of LP metric, right? Especially involving images, this distance is some kind of LP metric. So either, L infinity is the most common. Then people also look at L2 and L1. If the distance metric changes, then of course things will change. And people have also looked at other, more complicated things like Wasserstein and more perceptual distances, distances that are aligned to perceptual and perceptual metrics and so on. However, what happens is once you look at more complicated metrics, what happens is that you have to pay in the sense, you have to pay a computational cost, right? I mean, attacks and defenses in more complicated metrics take more computation. So that's kind of the more, that's kind of the dark side of it. Okay. And I will leave you with one more definition, astuteness. So what is astuteness? So when we talk about, when we talk about robustness, right? You can have a classifier that predicts the same level everywhere. And that classifier would be perfectly robust, right? So it's not enough to just talk about robustness. You also have to talk about accuracy, right? You also want your classifiers to be accurate, not just robust, because otherwise you could just, you could just predict 0 everywhere and be done with it. So So astuteness is a metric where we combine robustness and accuracy. And we say that the astuteness of a classifier at radius r is essentially, the fraction of points where it's correct. And for a ball of radius r around it, we are predicting the same label, right? So essentially you are robust at radius r around this x, and you are correct, right? And these are points, and recall that there was a probability. These are points from distribution D, right? So these are real images. So the fraction of real images according to this distribution, where you are correct, where you're predicting the right label, and where you are predicting the same label for a ball of radius r, right? And essentially when we are trying to do robust classification, our goal is to maximize not so much accuracy or robustness in isolation, but our goal is to maximize astuteness, right? We want to maximize the fraction of points where we are correct and we are robust. Okay. So remember, I started by talking about how this talk is going to be about why do we have adversarial examples, right? So why would we have adversarial examples? Well, there might be three possible reasons. So one plausible reason why we might have adversarial examples is that the data distributions might overlap, right? So maybe the distribution of pluses are very close to the distribution of minuses. So if you wanted to classify them correctly, there's no hope, right? If you wanted to classify them correctly, the pluses are like that, right? Maybe images of cats and images of dogs, almost overlap. So you can't really classify them accurately and robustly, right? So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that maybe that's not the case. Maybe the distributions are quite far, but maybe, we don't have enough samples to figure out how to place our classifiers, right? So, here, if you look at the second picture, what you will see is the pluses and minuses are far enough, but, you don't really know where to place the classifier, right? And if you place the classifier, you don't have enough data to place the classifier, right? If you place the classifier kind of the wrong way, you would end up with something that's not so robust. And then the third possibility is that we are not using the right algorithms to place our classifiers, right? We have a lot of data, the data distribution is well separated, so we can tease them apart. But somehow what we are doing is, we are just choosing the wrong classification algorithm. We are choosing the wrong way to find the boundary that separates the pluses from the minuses. And as a result, we are getting something that is not robust, right? That's the other possibility. And I will kind of give you the answer in advance. Actually, what we find is overwhelmingly, the third answer is true. Overwhelmingly, we are not using the right algorithms, and that is why we see adversarial examples. And what I'll do for the rest of the talk is I'll try to convince you that that's the case from some of the things that we have seen. Okay. And to be honest, to be fair, it's not really surprising because we didn't really start thinking about robustness until fairly recently. Until like maybe in the 2000s, some people thought about robustness, but not as much. And we have really now seriously started thinking about robustness since maybe 2013, 2014, and so on, right? So it's not a big surprise that the algorithms are not robust because they were not designed with robustness in mind. But that is, overwhelmingly the case. And so what that means is that moving forward, we need new algorithms. So this might be actually a good time to take any questions. And I see there's something on chat. So let me quickly take a look. Okay, that's not for me. Okay. Sorry, let me go ahead then. Okay, so that would be kind of the rest of the talk. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? So most of the talk, we will be talking about non-parametric methods, right? So what are non-parametric methods? So these are, things like an example of this would be nearest neighbors. Another example would be decision trees. Some other examples would be things like, random forests, kernel classifiers, and so on. So non-parametric methods are some highly flexible methods, right? So, if your data, for example, doesn't have to be linearly separable, right? If your data has some very complex pluses and minuses or very complex label space, your non-parametric methods can find the decision boundary. So these are highly flexible methods, and people have been using them for quite a while, right? So they've been using them for a very long time. So these are these highly flexible methods. And let me start out by telling you a little bit about what is known about non-parametric methods, right? So what can we say about them? So are these good methods at all? And so before that, let me give you one last definition and define the Bayes optimal classifier. Many of you have seen this already, right? So the Bayes optimal classifier is the classifier which has the highest accuracy on a data distribution, right? And this is the accuracy on the data distribution, right? So you can, until you have seen the entire distribution or until you know the distribution, you can't really you don't know what this classifier is, right? But it is reachable kind of in the infinite sample limit, right? So this is something that kind of theoreticians like to think about as kind of the desirable limit object, right? So if you had everything you needed, right? If you had everything you needed, like, if you had infinite data, infinite computation, everything you could ever wish for, this is what you would wish for, right? So this is like the gold standard, the Bayes optimal classifier, okay? So this is the thing that you want out of life if you had everything you needed, okay? So now, the good thing about non-parametric methods is that you will get to the, to the Bayes optimal classifier, but in the large sample limit. So, and this was a theorem proved by, a statistician called Stone, way back in 1977. So this was before even I was born. So, and I'm sure this was probably before many of you were born. So what he proved was something like this. As you get more and more training data, right? So as the training data size grows, under certain conditions, the accuracy of non-parametric methods, so many non-parametric methods will converge to the accuracy of the Bayes optimal classifier. And this is true for things like, nearest neighbors, provided, for k nearest neighbors, provided that k grows fast enough. This is true for decision trees under certain conditions. This is true for a whole bunch of very, interesting non-parametric classifiers, right? So as you get more and more training data, if you follow, if certain conditions hold, and I won't go into them right now because they're fairly technical conditions. If you follow certain conditions, if you construct your non-parametric classifier in a certain way, as your training data grows, its accuracy will converge to the accuracy of the Bayes optimal classifier. And this is provably true. So this was proved by Stone in 1977. Okay. However, at the time, people were not really looking into robustness. So the question that we start out with is, okay, so this is excellent news, but what about robustness? Okay. So to look at robustness, first, let's start out by looking at well-separated data. Okay, so so what do I mean by well-separated data? Remember, we started out by talking about, data distributions that might overlap, right? And, if data distributions do overlap, then you can't really hope to get, you can't really hope to classify things correctly and get robustness, right? So well-separated data is interesting because this is a case where you can get, both robustness and accuracy, okay? And so the question is, what do we mean by well-separated data? Well, so as it happens, the notion of well-separated data that is relevant in this case is something called R separation. Right? And we say that a data distribution is R separated if for any 2 points, right? So let's say we draw an xy and an x prime y prime, right? If the label of y, if the label y is not equal to y prime, then x and x prime has to be at least distance 2r apart. Okay. So so notice that this will, this kind of definition of R separation applies to any kind of metric, right? It applies to any kind of metric. And what it applies to any kind of metric. And the picture gives you an example of an R separated distribution, right? So what this is saying is that any red point and any gray point is going to be distance at least 2R apart. Okay. And why is this particular notion of R separation interesting? The reason why this particular notion of R separation is interesting is because if your data distribution is R separated, then in principle, at least, there exists a classifier that is astute at radius R. So in principle, you can get a classifier that is perfectly accurate, right? That has accuracy 1. And it is robust at the points at which it is accurate, and it's robust with radius R at the points at which it is accurate. Okay, so this is our definition of R separation. And this is kind of the reason why we care about R separated data. Okay, so there is at least such a classifier. Now the question is whether we can find it or not. Okay. So, okay, well, if we are going to talk about large sample limits, the question is what is the limit of robust classification, right? So when you have R-separated, data distributions, the Bayes optimal is actually not defined outside the support of the distribution, right? So you can have Bayes optimal classifiers, but they're undefined outside the distribution support. So what this means is, if you look at the picture, you can look at these blue lines, right? These blue lines will be Bayes optimal classifiers because they are classifying, with perfect accuracy, they are classifying the red and the gray points. But they're not really robust because if you look at the blue lines, in fact, they pass very close. So, the blue line on the left, it passes very close to the red points. And the blue line on the right, it passes very close to the gray points, right? So they're not actually robust, but they're perfectly accurate. So they are the Bayes optimal, right? So we don't really, so we may not want to, so converging to the Bayes optimal or to a Bayes optimal by itself may not be interesting. So what we want to do is instead, we propose what we call the R optimal, which is the classifier that maximizes astuteness, right? Because we don't only care about accuracy anymore, we also care about robustness plus accuracy. So what we want to do is we want to converge to the classifier that maximizes astuteness, okay? How do we define such a classifier? So we defined such a thing in an upcoming AI stats paper with some of my students and my postdoc. And the classifier, what does it is the following. So this classifier will predict plus if your distance from the support of the pluses is at most R, and it's going to predict minus otherwise, right? So there are, there can be many such classifiers, but here is one example of such a classifier, right? You predict plus if your distance from the support of the pluses is at most R, and you predict minus otherwise, right? And that will be, and that classifier, if you look at it a little bit closely, what you can see is that that classifier will have perfect accuracy. And that classifier will also be, it will be perfectly astute in the sense that it will have perfect accuracy. And it will be robust at radius R, robust with radius R at all the points from the distribution. Okay, so that is our R optimal classifier. Okay. So now, we have already talked about when non-parametric methods converge to the Bayes optimal. Question is, when do they converge to the R optimal, right? Like, do they automatically converge to the R optimal or not? And there the answer is actually interesting and more complicated. Okay, so now I will get to, slightly more technical parts of the talk. Let me tell you a little bit about how we are defining kind of general non-parametric classifiers here, right? So the way we are defining general non-parametric classifiers is through a set of weight vectors, right? So you're given a point X, right? And you have a training set S, and your non-parametric classifier is WS of X, right? And this is the sign of the weighted sum of the labels times a weight, WSIX. So WSIX is the weight given to X thanks to the training point XI, thanks to the training point XI. And this weight is multiplied by the label YI and then summed over. Okay. And I think a couple of examples will make things clear. So if you're talking about k nearest neighbors, so remember in the k nearest neighbor classifier, what we do is, let's say if you are doing 3 nearest neighbors, you would look at the 3 closest neighbors of X, and then you would, sum over their labels and you would take the sign, right? So this is for binary classification, okay? Basically that is taking the majority label among the 3 nearest neighbors, okay? So here, the way to write it would be, you would say that WSIX is 1 if XI is the closest, for one nearest neighbor, SIX would be 1. If XI is the closest neighbor of X in S, and it's 0 otherwise, right? So you're just getting one weight and you're just counting the label of the first nearest neighbor. If this was K nearest neighbor, then this W would be 1. If XI was one of the K closest neighbors, it would be 0 otherwise. Okay, so that would be, that is how you would represent the nearest neighbors classifier in this notation. For decision trees, if you have a decision tree, the decision tree will induce some partitioning of, each kind of leaf node of the decision tree induces a partitioning of the instance space, right, of the space of examples. And here you can also represent it in this, in this particular manner, in this particular framework. And here what would happen is WSI of X will be 1 if XI is in the same cell as X, where the cell is the partition induced by the nodes, by the leaf nodes of the decision tree. Okay, so you can also represent, both nearest neighbors and decision trees, and not just that, you can represent a whole bunch of classifiers in this framework. Okay. So what can we say about convergence to the R optimal? And here is kind of, this is again the most technical slide of this, and after this we will move on to other things. So what we can say is that this non-parametric classifier will converge to the R optimal in the large sample limit if the, kind of the following technical condition holds. And I won't go into the details of the technical condition, but what I will do is essentially kind of tell you intuitively what it means, right? So what this means is, as you get more and more samples, the most of your predictions should be local, right? In the sense that as you get more and more samples, most of your predictions should come from most of your predictions, and not just your predictions, most of the predictions of, nodes in a ball of radius, in a ball of a small radius around you, should come from, points in a radius B, right? Points in another small radius, and everything, and the influence of essentially everything else outside this radius should go to 0. Right? And it's so what we have is a little bit stricter than Stone's theorem. So what Stone's theorem says is this has to just happen for a particular, for all X. What our theorem needs is it has to happen for just X and a small, and points in a small radius around X, right? But the interesting thing is that if this happens, then what we can say is that this non-parametric method should converge to the R optimal, okay? And now the interesting thing is, what does converge to the R optimal, right? And the interesting thing that we can show is some non-parametric methods converge to the R optimal. But there are also a class of non-parametric methods that converge to the base optimal, but not the R optimal. And the methods that do converge to the R optimal in the large sample limit are, nearest neighbors and kernel classifiers, right? As n goes to infinity, they will converge to the R optimal. And by nearest neighbor, I mean nearest neighbor where the metric agrees with the metric of the distance metric agrees with D, okay? And the cases where it converges to the base optimal, but not the R optimal, are histograms and decision trees. Okay, and this is something we can show. And I will show you a quick example of what goes wrong with, histograms and also decision trees, right? So here is an example which shows what goes wrong with them, right? Suppose you have your pluses and minuses look like this, right? You can see there are the red points and the gray points, and they are distance 2r apart, right? So theoretically, there is a classifier that will give you robustness and accuracy, a classifier which goes like this, right? But if you are building a decision tree, what you would do is you would find a cell that separates the pluses and the minuses. And what you would see is that that cell gives you 100% accuracy, and you would stop, right? I mean, this is what the majority of decision tree producing algorithms would do, right? This is what, like your cart would do. This is what your, then on top of it, they would do some more pruning and so on. But that's what they would do, right? In this very simple examples, they would stop the minute they get 100% accuracy, and they won't split the cells anymore. And so even if you had an infinite number of samples, they will not converge to the R optimal, right? You can probably show that they would converge to A base optimal, but they would not converge to a robust solution. Okay, so what does it mean for us? So what it means for us is that, what we started out with talking about is that robustness depends on the training algorithm, right? Robustness depends on your algorithm. So if you choose something like a kernel classifier, or if you choose something like a nearest neighbor classifier, at least when you have an infinite number of samples, at least when data is not a concern, you would get to a robust solution when your data is well separated. Right? However, if that is not the case, right? If you are using something like at least the current decision trees and the current histogram style method, then you're not going to get robustness, right? You will get high accuracy, but no robustness, right? I mean, you may not get robustness even if your data is well separated. Okay. Okay. So now, what about the more general case, right? So far we talked about the case when data was well separated. What about the more general case? Okay. So notice that we have been talking about the more, so notice that so far we have been talking about our separated data distributions, right? So we have been talking about the case when data is well separated. We have not talked about the general case at all. Right? So in this case, the first thing to do before we can talk about this more general case is to talk about how we are even going to define the R optimal. Okay, so how do we even define the R optimal? Okay, so recall that we had started out by talking about astuteness, and the astuteness of a classifier F at radius R was the fraction of points according to the distribution on which we were accurate and on which were for a ball of radius R, we predicted the same label, okay? So the fraction of points where F was both robust and accurate, and our goal for robust classification was to maximize astuteness, okay? So how do we maximize astuteness? So suppose we have, again, suppose we have the, so suppose we have everything we need, right? Suppose we have a lot of data, suppose we have a lot of, data, have a lot of computation that we need, even in the large sample limit, what can we do? What is the classifier that maximizes astuteness in the large sample limit when data is not, in the general case? Well, suppose we have a classifier F that will predict a label J in a set Sj and will be robust, right? So S1, S2, S3 is where it is predicting labels 1, 2, and 3 and is robust. Then to ensure that you are getting robustness, right? The distance between these sets, right? The distance between any pair of points in these sets has to be at least twice R, right? When J is not equal to I. And the astuteness here is this following quantity, right? So here the astuteness would be the fraction of points. Essentially, you sum over all the labels. Then you look at each Sj. Sj is where you're predicting label J, and you look at basically the accuracy in that set. Okay, so that is your astuteness. And if you want to maximize the astuteness, that suggests the following classifier. You maximize this quantity that I just talked about, right? Sum over all the labels, each label J, the accuracy, if you predict J in this set, what is your accuracy? Subject to the fact that these sets are distance 2r apart, right? And your prediction rule will be, if you are within distance r of a particular Sj, then you predict label J, right? And you will never have a conflict because these sets are at least distance 2r apart, right? So you won't have a conflict if you use this prediction rule. Okay. Okay, so that is the most astute classifier. So that is what our R optimal will look like in the large sample case. Now the question is, this is kind of the Bayes this is kind of the analog of the Bayes optimal, right? This is what you would want if you had, lots of data and so on. Now the question is, how would you get a finite sample approximation? So, so one thing you could do is, remember this was our most astute classifier. One thing you could do is you could represent each SI, each set SI by a set of training examples, right? So if you try to do that, this leads you to the, you can convert this to the following optimization problem. And where instead of looking at this integral, you are converting this integral to a sum. And if you look at the sum very carefully, what it is, the solution to this optimization problem is the maximal subset of training samples where points with different labels are distance 2r or more apart. Okay, so the maximum set of subset of training samples. Sorry, just give me a second. Hey, can you take this child somewhere else? I cannot do a talk with this child. Sorry, my little child is just, it's her morning nap time. Anyway, yeah. So you take a maximal subset of training samples where points with different labels are distance 2r or more apart, right? And that's your, that's a representation of your R optimal. Okay, so you take those training samples. And that's your representation of your R optimal. Okay, so how do you solve this? How do you get the maximal subset of training samples? If this is a binary classification problem, what you can show is that this reduces to maximum by per type matching. If it is a KRE classification problem, right, if there are K classes, then, there's some sort of, it reduces to independent set in some sort of graph, and you can use a greedy algorithm. And then what you can do is just, you find this maximal subset of training samples, and then you build your classifier on it, right? So this subset of training samples is R separated. And now, once you have this this R-separated set of training samples, you just build your classifier, either your nearest neighbor or your decision trees or your random forest or whatever. You just build your classifier on it. Okay. And this is something that we call adversarial pruning, right? So you're pruning your data set, and then you're building your classifier on this prune set. And we did a bunch of experiments on it first, and this is our kind of AI stats paper, and we show that it actually works quite well in practice. It works reasonably, quite well in practice, particularly for things like nearest neighbors, and for decision trees, it works okay, not super well. So we can show that it works quite well in practice. And then we managed to also prove that if you combine adversarial pruning and, your algorithm, if you combine adversarial pruning and let's say nearest neighbor, then you would converge to R optimal in the large sample limit. So in that sense, you are doing the right thing, right? So if you can converge, so it does do the right thing. If you combine it with some sort of non-parametric classifier at the end, then you would actually get pretty decent results in practice, and it would also do the right thing in theory. Okay. So, so in conclusion, for at least for non-parametric methods, what we did is we proposed the R optimal, which is kind of a large sample limit object for robust classification. We showed that when our data is R separated, in the sense that, and that case is interesting because both robust and accurate classification is possible. Then we showed that nearest neighbors and kernels do converge to the R optimal. For non-separated data, we showed that what you need to do is you need to prune your data so that it's R-separated, and you can prune your data in kind of the optimal manner. That is the adversarial pruning procedure. And we showed that it works in the large sample limit. And what this all means is that at the end, for non-parametrics, robustness depends on the training algorithm, right? It's not, we were talking about large sample limits, we were talking about well-separated data. Even for well-separated data, infinite number of samples, some algorithms just won't do it. You have to go to, you have to use the right algorithm. Okay, so that is kind of the that's kind of the what we find for non-parametric methods. Okay, so maybe in the next 10 minutes, what I will do is I will briefly talk about how something similar is also kind of the case with neural networks. Okay, so let's see what this kind of things mean, right? So what this kind of analysis means, and we posit that this sort of thing is also sort of the case for neural networks. Okay, so so now we are going to change tracks a little bit, and we are going to talk very briefly about robustness in neural networks. And I'm going to, again, I'm going to focus on binary classification, and I'm going to look at kind of a simple abstraction for neural networks. Right, so neural networks, what they are going to do is they're going to compute a classifier. They're going to compute a function f of x on your data points x, and then we're talking about binary classification. It's kind of a simplistic thing. So what we will do is your classifier will output the sign of f of x. So if f is positive, then it will output label plus. If it's negative, it will output label minus. Right. So that's kind of the a very simple abstraction that we are looking at. And in this case, what happens is that your robustness comes from local smoothness. So if your neural network is kind of smooth, right, if this function f is smooth in the neighborhood of the data points, then if this function f is smooth and if your fx is bounded away from zeros, right? So if your fx is not very close to zero at the data points, and on the data distribution, if your fx is not very close to zero and it is smooth, then you are going to get both robustness and accuracy. Okay, so robustness will come from this kind of a local smoothness property. Okay, so what is known for neural networks? Again, there's a very large number of attacks. There are a few good defenses, which work reasonably well. However, even though the problem is very, very challenging for neural networks, it's not so simple. For non-parametric methods are relatively simple. For neural networks, the problem is extremely challenging. And unfortunately, all of these defenses show some sort of a robustness and accuracy trade-off. Unless you are looking at very, very simplistic data sets, all of these defenses, whenever you gain robustness, you're going to lose accuracy, right? Probably the only example where that's not the case is like MNIST or, very simple data sets. But the minute you get to something even a little bit more complicated, you're going to lose accuracy. Right? And the question that we will, kind of ask is this trade-off inevitable? Do we always have to pay for robustness? Or do we always have to pay for accuracy when we have robustness? And there's been some prior works which have conjectured that this trade-off may be inevitable, right? Like they have said that, maybe whenever you have robustness, you may have to just lose in accuracy, right? So you cannot have both robustness and accuracy at the same time. And what we posit, posit in this work is that that's not at least the case in principle. That's not at least the case in principle for the kind of real image classification tasks that we see. Okay. So what does real data look like? Remember, we started out by talking about R separation, right? Where our data distribution, our data is data distribution, our data set is R separated if points with different labels are at least distance 2r apart, right? So that's when your data distribution is R separated. And why is R separation important? Remember, earlier we had talked about, for non-parametric methods, we had talked about, R separation being important because there exists a classifier that gives you perfect robustness and accuracy, right? For neural networks, we can show that if your data distribution is R separated, then there exists a smooth function, right? There exists a function which gives you robustness and accuracy, and that function is smooth around the training data or around the data distribution, right? So that function should be smooth around the data, right? So, not only do we get robustness and accuracy, we should be able to get this through a smooth function. Okay, so that is why this kind of R separation is interesting in this particular case. Now the question is, okay, so we talked about this notion of R separation. Now the question is, does it hold for real data? And we looked at 4 real image data sets, and these are the data sets where people do the most adversarial example experiments, right? And what we did find is that real data is R separated. Okay, so these are the 4 data sets, and their separation to R is, the first column is their separation. So this is the minimum distance between 2 points in different classes, right? 2 examples in a different class. That is the second column. And the third column is the typical, attack perturbation that people use in adversarial example experiments, right? So typically for MNIST, what people use would be something like, 0.1, 0.03 for CFAR 10 and so on, right? And as you can see, if you look closely, that the typical S is much smaller than twice R. Right? So you want your S to be smaller than R, right? Like you want your S to be smaller than half the separation. And the typical S is way smaller than half the separation, right? And notice that there are some stars over here. The last 2 data sets have stars. So these data sets have, so SVHN has 2 examples, which are exactly the same, but have the same label. So this is after removing these 2 examples. Restricted ImageNet is, it's kind of a subset of ImageNet that people have been using in adversarial example experiments. So there, again, there are 2 or 3 examples that are very close. So this star in, so for MNIST and CFAR, we did not remove anything. For SVHN and restricted ImageNet, for SVHN, we removed 2 examples, and I believe for restricted ImageNet, we may have removed 3 or 4, right? For both these cases, we removed, let's just say, less than 5 examples. If you remove less than 5 examples, your separation is way, way higher than twice the typical perturbation radiuses that we use. Right? So what this means, combined with our theorem, what this means is there exists a classifier. So there exists a function F that is smooth, that is robust, that has robustness at these radii S's, and that gives you perfect accuracy. So in theory, at least, there are such things, right? In practice, however, so in theory, there shouldn't be any robustness accuracy trade-off, but in practice there is, right? And the question is what accounts for this gap, right? And, I can't say that we have a perfect answer to this question. And in fact, this is the biggest open question in the field. How do you get no robustness accuracy trade-off? We have some conjectures, and I can tell you, I'll tell you a little bit about that. Okay. So what we did was to understand what accounts for this gap. We looked at 4 standard image data sets, 7 different models, a bunch of different training methods. And for each of them, what we did is we measured this local smoothness, accuracy, as well as adversarial accuracy. So adversarial accuracy is the accuracy against adversarial examples at this kind of, at this radius, at this perturbation S. Okay. And the question that we asked was that, do we really see this, right? Is the local smoothness correlated with robustness, right? Is the robustness really coming from local smoothness? And kind of here are some results. So here we are measuring local smoothness by the Lipschitz constant, something called the Lipschitz constant. And we can't calculate this exactly, but we can approximate it. So what we have is probably an underestimate. So this is the Lipschitz constant. And high Lipschitz constant means less smooth. Okay, and what we do is we look at accuracy, and this is kind of a typical result. So different data sets have slightly different results, but this is kind of a typical result. So this is a result on CIFAR 10. And what we see is that the methods are divided into two kind of separate categories, right? So one category is, natural training, something called gradient regularization, which for some reason doesn't seem to work that well for CIFAR, and locally linear regularization, right? So those are so I'm just going to call them the red group. And then there is adversarial training, which is kind of the standard, thing we do, trades, and something called RST, which is a new kind of loss function that combines both adversarial training and clean accuracy, right? So in both of those cases, what happens is, so the gray methods, so these are the gray methods. The gray methods have low Lipschitz constants, which I mean which shows that they're smooth. However, they also have, on an average, they have lower accuracy, and they have pretty large generalization gaps. So what do I mean by generalization gap? So the generalization gap is the difference between the training and the test accuracy, whereas the adversarial generalization gap is the difference between the adversarial training accuracy, and so the training accuracy on adversarial examples around the training points, and the accuracy on adversarial examples around the training points, and the accuracy on adversarial examples around the test points, right? And these generalization gaps are actually quite high for the gray methods. And this is something we see overall over all of the data sets, except maybe MNIST. MNIST is just too easy, but this is something we see over a range of things. Okay, so the first group is kind of less smooth but more accurate, and the second group is more smooth but less accurate. Okay, and the generalization gaps are low for these first groups, and the generalization gaps are high for the second groups. Okay, so this suggests that one of the problems that may happen may be generalization, right? So maybe, loss function wise and optimization wise, we are probably okay, but generalization wise, there may be a problem. So we tried a few different things to see if generalization is helped. So one of the things we tried was dropout, because dropout is, one of the big, it was kind of a big breakthrough in generalization for neural networks, right? When we started with looking at accuracy. So we looked at dropout, and here are some results. So we tried to do dropout on top of, all these methods. And what we found was that it does help generalization, but to a little bit. It doesn't help it too much, but it helps it by a couple of, 1 or 2% points. Okay. So, and so what we find is that, especially for trades, what happens is the Lipschitz constant goes down. So the function becomes smoother. The accuracy also goes up a little bit for all these, so the red numbers are numbers where it went up. The accuracy goes up a little bit, and the generalization gap goes down. Right, the generalization goes down, accuracy goes up a little bit. For trades, in fact, it helps a fair bit. So for trades, the function becomes smoother, the accuracy goes up, and the adversarial accuracy goes up. And then the generalization gap generally goes down. So with dropout, the thing is that the training the training accuracy won't be as much as 100% because you are regularizing very hard during training, but it does seem to help a little bit. And so what we observe is that the smoother methods tend to be, more robust than the less smooth methods, which, I talked about briefly. The smoother methods do have a large generalization gap, and dropout reduces this gap, although by a little, but it does reduce it a little bit, okay, by a couple of percent points. So in conclusion, for neural networks, what it seems like is real data is in fact R separated, right? So, this R separation we had started, it was motivated by trying to understand, it was motivated by theory, but it does happen for a lot of real data sets. It is R separated. And so a consequence of that is that robust and accurate neural networks do exist, at least on these training data points, with those test data points, you should be able to get something, right? They do exist. However, the current algorithms are not successful in finding them, possibly because of generalization, right? And so what we do need to focus on, so what we do need to do for, so robustness is not really at odds with accuracy, even for neural networks. And so what we do need to do is we need to find better methods for adversarial generalization. And these better methods, they may not be just through loss functions, right? Because, for neural networks, generalization is really quite complicated, right? The generalization depends on what optimization method you're using. Are you using Adam, SGD, so on and so forth? It depends on what architectures you're using. If you choose the wrong architectures, you're not going to get the right results. And we just haven't done all of that for robust methods, right? So we need to look at generalization. We do have a lot of loss functions, but probably what we need is a lot of these other things, maybe other architectures, maybe other, optimization methods, because at this point, the real problem is that adversarial generalization is kind of the big problem. Okay, and again, these are kind of our these are kind of the paper references, and I will just stop by thanking all my co-authors. So Yao Yan is my student who did a lot of the non-parametric methods work and some of the neural networks work. Ishen is also my student who's done a lot of work on non-parametric methods. Robi is my theory student who proved all the hard theorems. Cyrus is a postdoc in my group. Hong Yang and Ruslan are our collaborators, and so by thanking them, so they are responsible for a lot of the work in these papers. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. Yeah. So is there any question from the audience? So you can either directly ask the question or you can type in your questions in the chat. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with my questions.
Okay.
So yeah, so I think the neural network part is very interesting. So one question is, how do you compute the Lipschitz constant? Is this local Lipschitz or like a global Lipschitz?
Yes, so we do. So the way we do this is we do this through a PGD-like procedure.
Okay.
So it's through a PGD-like procedure, and it is an underestimate. So it's a stronger PGD-like procedure than what we use for training.
Mm-hmm.
So it's better than what we use for training, but it is an underestimate.
I see.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think there is. It may be NP hard to compute it exactly.
Yeah. So it's like it computes for every point and then do the average. Okay.
Do the average, yes.
And I think so. I think from your final table, the page 54.
54.
So
yes.
once you add a drop, so this is really interesting. So once you add a dropout, I think the clean accuracy, the clean training accuracy doesn't drop too much, but looks like the training adversarial accuracy drops quite a bit. Is it? Because the adversarial generation gap is decreasing by like 10%.
Yes. That is
the adversarial accuracy is only improved by 2%. So probably
that is true. So because I think dropout, it regularizes really hard and it makes. It's very strange. So dropout, you can get contradictory results where the training accuracies go down. But you are absolutely right that the adversarial training accuracy actually goes down even more.
Yeah.
And then but the test goes up a little bit. And I think it may be because dropout is just making things a little bit smoother.
Okay. Yeah, maybe it depends on like how much dropout you add. You might
Right.
get
So
different.
this one was, I think the sidebar was, I think the standard numbers are, the first layer is 0.5 and then the other layers are 0.9.
Okay.
This one may have been a little bit less.
Okay. Nice. Yeah, thank you. So
Any
is
more
there
questions?
any more questions?
Hi,
Yeah,
Professor.
I think we can wrap up here and then like swap the presenters.
Oh, okay. So
Okay,
it's,
let me unshare my screen. Okay. Sorry, give me a second. Stop.
okay. Yeah, thank you for the nice talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I stopped sharing, right? I think.
Yeah, yeah. You already.
Can you like try your presentation and make sure everything's working properly? Okay, yeah, looks good.
Yeah. Oh, so Chen is already
Right.
sharing the slide.
Okay, yeah, I think it's on time now. Yeah, so I think we can get started.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so yeah, so we're happy to have our next speaker invited talk by Professor Gu in UCLA. So Professor Gu is has done a lot of work on like neural network theory. Like I think he has like pioneering work on generalization of neural network and some like analysis on overparameterized network. And also he got several important awards, including career awards and several others. So today, Professor Gu will talk about his recent work on like understanding, improving, and evaluating adversarial robustness. So let's welcome Professor Gu for his talk.
Okay, thank you, Jory, for the nice introduction, and it's my great pleasure to give talk in this workshop. And thank you again, the organizers of this workshop and the audience of this workshop for attending this talk and inviting me to give this talk. So compared with many people in this workshop who have done much more work in this field, actually, I only done several work in this field. So today I would like to share some of my understandings and discoveries from my work on adversarial machine learning. So I aim to understand, improve, and evaluate the adversarial robustness in deep learning through the lens of differentiating the misclassified and correctly classified examples and the ways of neural network, and also using hard label attack to come up with a more effective evaluation of adversarial robustness. This is a joint work with my excellent students, Di Fanzhou, Jinghui Chen at UCLA, and many other great collaborators in other places. So I don't think I need to define adversarial example in this workshop because all the people in this workshop are familiar with this, and we've seen similar examples in a previous talk given by Kamalika. So just briefly introduce the definition of adversarial example. And we all know that neural networks are variable to adversarial examples, which was originally pointed out in Goodfellow's work in 2013. And here I'll give you another example. Suppose you have an image of pig, which can be correctly classified by the neural network. And then if you add some perturbation, which is usually not random, but generated by some adversarial attack method to this image of pig, then the neural network will misclassify this image of pig to be a airliner with very high confidence. And we call this perturbed image, which is misclassified as an airliner, as the adversarial example. So many people make a joke about this example as machine learning can make pigs fly. And you may wonder that why adversarial example is important to study and is important to prevent in the applications of deep learning. So here's another more important example which raises a severe security concern to deep learning communities. So suppose you are building a self-driving cars, and you use some cameras to take an image of the traffic sign and to do automatic traffic sign classification. Suppose the authentic input is a stop sign. However, on some adversarial perturbations, you will get a slightly different image, which by human eyes, it still looks like a stop sign. But the neural network will misclassify the stop sign as a yield sign. And this will cause a serious problems because the self-driving car won't stop if it misclassifies the stop sign. And it might hit other vehicles or pedestrians on the street, and which may cause the loss of human lives. So through this example, we can see that adversarial example is not like just a fun problems to study, but also is a safety critical problems to study in deep learning research. So there's a lot of work has been done in this field, including both adversarial attacks and adversarial training. Many of this great work are done by people in this workshop. So in this talk, I will mainly focus on 3 research questions. And I will share with you some of our solutions to partially attack these 3 challenges. So there's still a lot of room to improve, I have to admit. So our work just give you some insight about how to tackle these 3 challenges. The first challenge is how to improve the state-of-the-art adversarial training method, which I will tackle this challenge through a lens of introducing the differentiation between correctly classified examples and misclassified examples. The second challenge is about the understanding the impact of neural network architectures on adversarial robustness. And the last challenge is how to evaluate the robustness of trained models by different defense methods. Okay, so let me start with the tackling the first challenge, how to improve the state of art in adversarial training. So let me have you review the standard formulation of adversarial training, which is formulated as a min-max optimization problems. So this formulation was originally proposed in Malware et al. In 2017. So they formulate the adversarial training as a min-max optimization problems where the inner maximization is generate a lot of adversarial examples by maximizing the loss function over a ball centered at the original training example. And this inner maximization can be solved by many optimization algorithms, including projected gradient descent. And once you generate the adversarial examples, then you just put them together and do a regular neural network training, which corresponds to the outer minimization problems. Okay, so in other words, you can feel the inner maximization as data augmentation, and you feel the outer minimization as a regular neural network training. And this is a key idea of adversarial training. And remember that the adversarial example, which I just show you 2 instances of adversarial examples, the image of pig and the image of stop sign. So in those 2 illustrated examples, the adversarial example is defined as a clean example, X, which can be correctly classified by the neural network. And then if you find a perturbation of X, which is denoted by X height prime in the neighborhood of X, and it will be misclassified by the same neural network. And in this case, we say X height prime is a adversarial example of the original example X. Okay, but what is missing in the current formulation of adversarial training is when you write down this min-max optimization problems, actually you do not explicitly consider whether the original example can be correctly classified, which is actually implicitly assumed in the definition of adversarial examples. So a natural question is, what about those misclassified examples that cannot be correctly classified by the adversarial trained neural network? Okay, in other words, for those X where the neural network prediction does not equal to the ground truth label, should we just ignore those examples, or should we treat them the same as the correctly classified examples, or should we do something different? Right. So this is the key motivation of this work. And we first run some experiments to get a basic idea about the influence of misclassified examples. As I mentioned before, when you do adversarial training, when you solve the inner maximization problems, you are essentially generating adversarial examples. So we defined two sets. The first set is called S-, which are those misclassified examples, misclassified by the model trained by standard adversarial training. And we define a size of equal size called S+, which contains the same amount of correctly classified examples, correctly classified by the model trained by standard adversarial training. Okay. And then we compare the three baseline methods. The first baseline is we do standard adversarial training, and we do PGD-based attack to solve the inner maximization problem by attacking those examples in both S- and S+. So in other words, we attack both correctly classified example and misclassified examples using PGD when we solve the inner maximization problem in standard adversarial training. And the second baseline is we only perturb those examples, only those misclassified examples. And the last baseline is we only perturb those correctly classified examples. And as you can see from this plot, so the x-axis is training epoch, the y-axis is robust accuracy. So if you don't perturb the correctly classified examples, actually the performance job is a little bit compared with perturbing both misclassified example and the correctly classified example. But if you don't perturb the misclassified examples, okay, which is the example containing S-, the performance job is very significant. Okay, it's more than 3 or 4%. So from this example, it suggests that misclassified example actually have a great impact on the robustness of the model trained by adversarial training. Okay, and let's do some additional experiments to see what kind of use of misclassified example matters more in adversarial training. Because adversarial training is a min-max optimization problems, so there are two key steps. One is solving the inner maximization problem. The other is solving the outer minimization problem. And in both steps, we can treat the misclassified examples in a certain way. And we will see in which step misclassified examples matters more than the other. Okay, so we first did experiments in the inner maximization problems, which is nothing but just applying different attack algorithms to attack the original examples, to perturb the original examples to get adversarial examples. Okay, and we did a PGD attack on both S- and S+, which are defined in previous slide. And then we replace PGD10 by FGSM, which is a fast gradient sum method. It essentially performs one-step projected gradient descent on the correctly classified examples. And then we replace the, for example, PGD10 on the misclassified examples by FGSM on the misclassified examples. Okay. And by comparing these three baseline methods, we found that the performance of adversarial training only changes a little bit when you use different attack methods on correctly classified example and misclassified example. So that suggests that the effect caused by different attack method on the misclassified example actually is negligible. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we modify the outer minimization problems. We also compare three baselines. The first baseline is we don't do any additional regularization. We don't do those smoothness based regularization like KL divergence regularization used in trees. In that case, the performance is in this blue curve. And if we add KL divergence based regularization on S+ on those correctly classified examples, the performance will be increased by about 2%. And if we further add KL divergence based regularization on those misclassified examples, the performance will be further increased by 2%. Okay, so this suggests that when treating the misclassified examples in a certain way in the auto minimization, we can actually significantly improve the robust accuracy. Okay, and this motivates us to modify the training loss of adversarial training method, of existing adversarial training method, to come up with a better way to use the misclassified examples in auto minimization problems. Okay. And in order to do that, let's first take a look at the standard adversarial risk, which is the average of the risk, where each of the risk is defined as the maximization over the zero-1 loss, where the maximization is over the perturbation ball of the clean example. Okay, and we can separate the training data into two sets. One is S plus, the other is S minus. So S plus is those examples that are correctly classified, and S minus are those examples that are misclassified. Okay, and for those correctly classified examples, we just use the standard zero-1 loss to measure its risk. And for those misclassified examples, we introduce a modified loss function, which is the sum of the 0-1 loss defined on the perturbed example and another regularization term, which encourages the smoothness or the stability of the neural network prediction when you compare the prediction on the clean example and the prediction on its perturbation. Okay. And by putting these two pieces together, we come up with this misclassification aware adversarial risk, which is the sum of these two components. When you do the summation, you basically differentiate the examples, misclassified examples from the correctly classified examples, and use different loss on these two types of examples. Okay, so this is the main idea of this misclassification aware adversarial risk. Since it's a 0-1 loss, so it's hard to optimize. Therefore, we first relax this 0-1 loss based misclassification aware adversarial training by some convex surrogate loss functions. So in detail, we relax the first 0-1 loss by the so-called boosted cross-entropy loss, which is a modified cross-entropy loss by subtracting the margin term from the standard cross-entropy loss. So remember that the second term actually is a margin term, which is inspired by the hinge loss people are using in support vector machine, multi-class support vector machine. And then we relax the second term, which is the regularization term by the care divergence-based regularization between the logic output on the clean example and the logic output on the perturbed example. So this is inspired by the regularization used in trees, which was also discussed in previous talk. And lastly, we relax this weight, this indicator function by the soft weight, which is a probability that the xi will be misclassified by the current neural network S data. And we also add additional tuning parameter lambda here, just to make sure that we will have a good trade-off between the risk function and the regularization term. So by putting these three pieces together, we come up with the loss function for our method. We call it MART, misclassification aware adversarial training. And let me do a very quick comparison between the loss functions of the different adversarial training method. For standard adversarial training, the loss function is a cross-entropy loss defined on the perturbed example. And for ALT, which is proposed in this paper, they basically add the additional L2 norm-based regularization on the logic output of the neural network between the clean example and the perturbed example. Okay. And for CLT, they replace the cross-entropy on the perturbed example by the cross-entropy on the clean example in ALT. And for trees, it essentially replaces the L2 norm-based regularization by the care divergence-based regularization, and using the same cross-entropy loss on the clean example. Okay, and there's an interesting work called MMA. They also differentiate the correctly classified example and the misclassified example, but they only use different loss on these two types of example. They use cross-entropy on the perturbed example on the correctly classified example, and they use cross-entropy loss on the original example when the original example is misclassified. They don't do any additional regularization. Okay. For our method, we use a modified loss function and also use different regularization for different kinds of examples, which are correctly classified example and misclassified examples. Okay, so this is the comparison among the loss function of these several adversarial training methods. Now let me show some experimental results. So we use this adversarial training method to train ResNet 18 on both MNIST dataset and the CIFAR-10 dataset. After we train the model, we first use the white box-based attack method to attack the resulting model. And you can see that on the white box attack, such as FGSM or PGD20 or CW, our model can give the highest robust accuracy on the white box attack on both datasets. Okay. And we also tried the black box-based attack to evaluate the robustness of the trained model. And again, on those black box attack, including FGSM, PGD10, PGD20, and CW, our method can also give the highest robust accuracy compared with many previous adversarial training methods, including the state-of-the-art method tree. Okay, so this illustrates the effectiveness of the new loss function, which is inspired by the misclassified example in adversarial training. Okay. And we also consider larger neural network, which is a wider ResNet on CIFAR-10 dataset. And we do the white box attack using the same attack method, including FGSM, PGD20, PGD100, and CW to attack the robustly trained models. And our model on this setting also gives the highest robust accuracy. Okay, so this pretty much illustrates the effectiveness of the new loss function, which is differentiate the misclassified example from the correctly classified example. And recently, we noticed that there are some work showing that if you use additional unlabeled data to regularize the loss function in adversarial training, then you will achieve even better model robustness. So here are two methods using unlabeled data in adversarial training. One is called UAT++. The other is called RST. So RST is also introduced in previous talk. And this method are considered as the state-of-the-art adversarial training method with additional unlabeled data. And we just modify the loss function in our method by adding the additional KR divergence regularization term on those unlabeled data. Then we basically come up with a semi-supervised version of MART. And we use this semi-supervised version of MART to train wide ResNet on CIFAR-10 with 100K unlabeled data. And we can see that our method can beat both UAT++ and RST by about 2% on the PGD20 attack. Okay, and we also increase the unlabeled data from 100K to 500K, and all the methods can get better robust accuracy. But again, our method can get the highest robust accuracy among these three methods. Okay, so from this part of the talk, I basically want to show that in traditional adversarial training, people somehow ignore the misclassified examples, because when you write down the object function of adversarial training, they simply ignore the difference between adversarial trained misclassified example and the correctly classified example. And in this work, we just revisit that problem and illustrate that if you do something different for correctly classified example and misclassified example, you can get some surprise. You can get a good performance gain during adversarial training. Okay. Then I'm gonna move to the second part of my talk, which is try to understand the impact of neural network architecture on adversarial robustness. And in particular, I would like to know whether the network width can help adversarial robustness. So in other words, whether the wider the neural network, the better the robustness you will achieve. Okay. The reason why I'm interested in this question is people often say that wider models generally enjoy better adversarial robustness. This is first illustrated in Mojo et al. Paper in 2017. And their hypothesis is that in order to separate the adversarial examples, you need a more complex decision boundary, which is illustrated in these two examples. If you do adversarial training, you often end up with a more complex decision boundary. And in order to enable the occurrence of this more complex decision boundary, you need more complex models. Okay, so that's why they think the wider the model, the better the adversarial robustness will be. And this common belief has never been carefully examined in the literature. And when I read this paper, I was thinking, oh, whether this is always true. And if this is true, then why this is true? Then my student and I did some experiments to test this hypothesis. We use trees to train a wide ResNet on CIVA10 dataset. And we try different widths of the neural network. Because we are using wide ResNet, so it's very easy to set the width of the neural network in wide ResNet. We only need to configure the widen factor in wide ResNet. So when the widen factor equal to 1, it will reduce to ResNet. And we try the widen factor equal to 3 to 5 to 7 to 10. So basically, we try the wider and wider ResNet. And we calculate the natural accuracy achieved by these models trained by trees. As we can see, when we increase the width of neural network, the natural accuracy actually keeps increasing. However, the robust accuracy, or someone called the adversarial accuracy, it first increase and then decrease. So actually, this is not a surprising result because intuitively speaking, there's no free lunch. If you increase the model capacity, you have to pay some price in terms of bias and fairness trade-off. But why this is the case is still mysterious, because adversarial training is a min-max optimization problem, and it's not widely studied before in the literature. Although in standard statistical learning theory, we know there's a fairness bias trade-off, but it's not clear whether similar phenomena is still hold in adversarial training. Okay, so then we want to take a closer look and try to provide some explanation to this kind of phenomenon. So we take a closer look at those so-called robust examples, which are those examples that are correctly classified, and all the neighbors in this example are also correctly classified. So we call this kind of example as a robust examples. And similarly, we define the correctly classified example, which is a pretty simple and standard, and the stable examples, which are those examples that both itself and all its neighbors in its neighborhood are predicted to be the same label by the neural network. But remember that stable examples does not mean that the example will be always correctly classified, because it's possible that both itself and its neighbors will be misclassified by the same neural network. And based on these three definitions, we can verify that the robust examples actually is at the intersection of correctly classified example and the stable examples. Okay. And during the adversarial training, we will monitor the size of this three sets. And we will show that actually during adversarial training, if you don't do proper regularization, then the size of a stable example will shrink, and the size of correctly classified example will increase. And the size of robust examples actually depends. It can increase and it can also decrease. And in order to make sure that the size of a robust example will increase, you have to do very careful regularization in adversarial training. Okay. So before I show the regularization, let me show you three plots. So this is the adversarial training plot by trees on ResNet on CIVA10 dataset. So the left figure is the robust accuracy, The middle figure is the natural accuracy, and the last one is the stability. So stability basically is the measure to measure the difference between prediction on the original example and the prediction on the perturbed example. Okay. And you can see that for robust accuracy, actually during training, the robust accuracy increase, and during training, the natural accuracy also increase. But this is not what we want to show. What is more interesting is if you look at these curves, which correspond to different widths of wide rise net, you can see that the wider the neural network, the higher the natural accuracy. So this is already illustrated in previous table. But what is not illustrated in previous table is if you increase the width of the neural network, the stability of the neural network under the same regularization parameter actually drops more, drops faster than using a narrow neural network. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, which suggests that if you don't do a good regularization, then you may lose stability. You may end up with worse stability. And since the robust accuracy is somehow a combination or a trade-off between natural accuracy and stability, because you have a bad stability, then you will have bad robust accuracy. Okay. And mathematically speaking, in order to illustrate this through some mathematical formula, let me rewrite the standard the field training in this way. So basically, in the maximization problems, I rewrite it as a sum of the natural loss function and the difference between the adversarial risk and the natural risk. Okay, and when you choose lambda equal to 1, actually this reduces to standard adversarial training loss function. Okay. And for trace method, actually they just approximate this robust regularization term by the KL divergence-based regularization. And that will give you the loss function used by trace. Okay, so in this experiment, I don't explicitly use KL divergence to measure the difference of this term. I directly calculate the dynamic of this term during adversarial training. And to do that, I define a criteria, which is the gradient norm of this robust regularization term. Because gradient is the direction when you, for example, minimize the entire loss function, gradient is the direction that function will increase. And negative gradient is the direction that the loss function will decrease. And the larger the gradient norm, that means the more significant role this regularization will play during the optimization. And the smaller the gradient norm, then the less significant role this regularization term will play during the field training. So I introduced this gradient norm-based criteria, which measures the effect of the robust regularization term. And I also normalize this gradient norm by the tolerance of the perturbation, just to make sure that when we do the plot, it will be on the same order of magnitude for better illustration. And then I plot this criteria for different ways of neural network trained by standard adversarial training. So the x-axis is the number of epochs, and the y-axis is this criteria. And it's very clear that if you use wider neural network, then you will get a smaller regularization effect. So here, when we do this plot, we just ignore the regularization parameter. We choose regularization parameter to be the same. Okay, so this suggests that the robust regularization effect will downgrade as the network becomes wider and wider. And this actually is contradicted to the common belief that if you use wider neural network, you will get more robust models. Okay. Then the next question is how to design or how to come up with a solution to tackle these problems. Okay. So the solution actually is very simple. In order to make wider network more robust, we just need to increase the robust regularization by using larger regularization parameters. And to verify this idea, we carried out some experiments. We use trace method to train different to train the wide ResNet on CIVA10 dataset. And we try different regression parameters, ranges from 6, 9, 12, 15 to 18. Okay. So in the original trade paper, they use regression parameter equal to 6. Here we try larger regression parameters. And as you can see, for wider networks, for example, with Widen factor equal to 5 or Widen factor with equal to 10, we need to use a larger regression parameter such as 15 or 18 to give the highest robust accuracy when we apply the traits to train the robust model. And for natural accuracy and stability, the pattern is not that clear. But for robust accuracy, the pattern is for wider network, you need to go with larger regression parameter. And based on this observation, we just proposed to increase the regression parameter in traits. And we carry out the same experiment as the one used in the studied in traits paper. And we trained the wide ResNet on CIVA10 dataset. And we evaluate the trained model by 3 different kind of attack methods, including PGD20 with step size equal to 0.003, and the PGD20 with step size equal to 0.007, and also the CW attack. And in the original paper, they report the robust accuracy as like 57 on the PGD20 with step size equal to 0.003. And robust accuracy equal to 55.88 on the PGD attack with step size equal to 0.007. And in the reproduced experiments by many other follow-up work, they found that the robust accuracy is actually 55 and 54 on these 2 attacks. And by using larger regression parameter, so we don't change anything in the trait training except the regression parameter, we will be able to improve the robust accuracy from 55% to 58% under this attack, or from 54% to 58% on another PGD attack. And for CW attack, we can also improve the robust accuracy by about 2%. So this verify So this part of work first defalsify the traditional belief that a wider network can give you better robustness. We show that only if you are using appropriate regression, which is a larger regression, when you go with a wider neural network, then you will be able to achieve better robustness in adversarial training. Otherwise, by increasing the width of the neural network, you may not be able to increase the robustness of the neural network. Okay, finally, I would like to talk about how to evaluate the robustness of deep neural network models. So in previous materials in my talk, when we do evaluation, we use either white box attack or use black box attack. So a natural question is, are these attacks the best attacks that we can use to evaluate the model robustness? Okay. And in this part, I will talk about the hard label attack, which is another type of attack method used in studied in adversarial machine learning. Just give you a quick overview about white box attack, black box attack, and hard label attack. The key difference among these 3 attacks is white box attack is probably the simplest attack because the attacker can access the internal structure of the neural network, including the gradient of the neural network. For black box attack, the attacker can only access the logic output and the prediction label, but it cannot access the gradient of the neural network or other information about the internal thing in the network. And for hard label attack, the attacker can only access the prediction label. It cannot access the logic output or the internal structure of the neural network. So it's clear that hard label attack is the most difficult attack because the attacker can access the minimum information of the neural network. And the key idea of hard label attack is to find the decision boundary, right? because for each training example or test example, if you can find the nearest decision boundary, then you will know what's the minimum amount of perturbation you need to perturb the example to make sure it will cross the decision boundary. Then the attack is successful. And following this idea, there are a lot of brilliant work in the literature. They formulate hard label attack as this mean, actually bi-level optimizing problems. So I would like to mention the work by Chen et al. Actually, the author of the organizer of this workshop, Chori and his student and collaborators, they come up with the OPT attack and the Sun OPT attack, which to my knowledge is the first optimization-based hard label attack method. So the idea of a hard label attack in their work is they want to find some search direction D, such that along this direction, if you perturb the example, you will get the minimum perturbation distance. So the object function G of D here is defined as the result of another minimizing problem. So this is a bi-level optimizing problem. And the OPT attack can be solved by zeros order optimization, where in each iteration of zeros order optimization, you need to do binary search to solve these inner minimization problems, basically finding the smallest perturbation distance around the direction D. And this method is mainly for L2 norm threat models. And inspired from this work, we consider L infinity threat model, and we will formulate the continuous optimization problem into a discrete optimization problem. So instead of searching in the RD space, we are searching the perturbation direction in a D-dimensional hypercube. And each point on the hypercube actually is a binary vector. Each coordinate of the vector takes value either -1 or +1. Okay. And in order to solve this bi-level discrete optimizing problems, we propose a new algorithm called re-searching algorithm, which is nothing but a local search algorithm. The idea of this algorithm is very simple. We just start with a direction. For example, the direction corresponds to all 1 vectors. And then we flip the first coordinate of the vector from +1 to -1. And then we calculate the distance to the nearest decision boundary. If this distance is smaller than the current biased distance, then we will keep the flip. Then we try the second coordinate, and we flip this coordinate from 1 to -1. And again, we calculate the distance along this direction from the example to the nearest decision boundary. And if that distance is worse than the current biased perturbation distance, then we will flip the coordinate back to +1, because this is not a good direction. And this process will be iteratively performed in a sequential way. And we not only do 1 pass, we may potentially do multiple passes until this algorithm will converge. And we can prove that although this is a local search algorithm, there's no global automatic guarantee. But by doing this kind of a search, when algorithm terminates, it will output a local optimal to the object function of hard label attack. And in order to accelerate these local search algorithms, we also introduce some additional mechanisms to accelerate its convergence. The first mechanism is called fast track. So the idea is very simple. Suppose D is the current biased direction, and R is the current biased perturbation distance. And the next iteration, when we come up with a new search direction, we will search along that direction using the biased current distance. For example, if this is the next direction, then we will try perturbing the example around this direction using the biased distance. After the perturbation, if the example is still within the original region, it does not cross the decision boundary, then that means even if you find a good distance to cross the decision boundary, that distance will always be larger than the current biased distance. So this direction is not a good direction to further explore. Therefore, you can give up this direction. And here is another example. Suppose the next direction is this direction. And you try this direction by to perturb the example around this direction by the current byte distance. Suppose the perturbed example will cross the decision boundary. Then that means this direction is a good direction. And then we will do further binary search to calculate the perturbation distance. Okay, so this fast track can save a lot of computational overhead when we implement the local search algorithm. And another mechanism we implemented in the algorithm is called hierarchical search. So this is inspired by many recent papers, which they call it spatial correlation or PRI in, for example, Elias et al. Or Moon et al. Or AI Li et al. So the idea is very, I think it's a very novel idea. So they divide the search direction into several blocks. Since I've been working on optimization as well, so this idea is a little bit similar to block coordinate descent, but not exactly the same. So they first divide the search direction into two parts. And every time they flip all the coordinates in the first, for example, half of the search direction, and then calculate the distance. If it's shorter than the current byte distance, they retain the flip. Otherwise, they flip it back. And then they further divide the first half of the search vector, direction vector, into two parts and do the same thing. And this process will be repeated until the convergence of the algorithm. So in theory, there's no guarantee that this will give you faster convergence. At least I don't know how to prove that. But in practice, this kind of hierarchical search idea turns out to be very, very effective. Now let me show some experimental results. So we compared our race hard label attack algorithm with several state-of-the-art algorithms, including OPT, SIGN OPT, and HSJ, and on different data set and different neural networks. And you can see that under the same query numbers, our hard label attack method can always give the highest attack success rate. So in other words, our hard label attack method is very query efficient. We only require a small number of queries, like 2,000 or 3,000 number of queries to achieve a very high attack success rate, which is close to 100%. But this is not the ultimate goal of this work. The reason we are interested in hard label attack is to use hard label attack to evaluate the model robustness. So as I mentioned before, we can use white box and black box attack to evaluate the model robustness. But these attacks are the really ultimate way to evaluate the model robustness. So in my opinion, while this attack method can provide some evaluation method to evaluate model robustness, but they are not a good evaluation method because they can be deceived by the so-called obfuscated gradient problems. Because if you hide the gradient, or if you don't allow the attacker to access the gradient, of course, you will make the attacker less effective. But on the other hand, you could end up with some falsely robust models that are prone to those obfuscated gradient mechanisms. But for our race attack method, it is totally gradient free because we don't need to calculate the gradient of the neural network. And it also independent of the loss function used for adversarial training. So remember that the race algorithm is a pure search algorithm. It has nothing to do with gradient. It has nothing to do with the loss function you are using for adversarial training. Therefore, based on this race attack, we propose a new metric called average decision boundary distance, which is the average L infinity norm distance between all test examples to their closest decision boundary. And this distance is a byproduct of hard label attack achieved by race. And now, given this average decision boundary distance, we are able to evaluate the model robustness. We first evaluate the model robustness of adversarial training and the traits. And according to our experiments, you can see that in terms of hard label attack accuracy, our method indeed gives the lowest robust accuracy. That means our hard label attack is indeed the most effective one compared with the other two baselines. But what is more interesting here is if you look at the robust accuracy of a model trained by adversarial training on the black box attack or even white box attack, the robust accuracy is about 50-ish. But the robust accuracy on the race attack is about 54%. It's very close to 50. This is a good indicator that the race hard label attack, even though it accesses less information, but in terms of attack performance, it's very close to black box and white box attack. And a similar result can be observed on the model trained by trees. So on the one hand, race is the most effective attack, hard label attack method. And on the other hand, it can achieve very close robust accuracy with the best black box and the white box attack method, which are like 56 or 57% robust accuracy. Now, let's take a look at some other recently proposed robust training method or adversarial defense method, which claim to achieve the state-of-the-art robustness. So we picked these three methods because when we did this project, these methods are the state-of-the-art result for adversarial defense. So the first method is called science. They train original examples if the original example cannot be correctly classified. Otherwise, they train on the adversarial examples. The second method is called feature scattering. So they are basically introducing some examples that maximize the feature matching distance, some criteria, and they train on that examples. And the last method is called adversarial interpolation. It trained on the adversarial trained interpolated examples and labels. And we apply the same set of attack methods, including hard label attack, black box attack, and white box attack on the model trained by these three methods. So you can see that the robust accuracy on the race attack actually is pretty low. It's lower than the robust accuracy that you can achieve by standard adversarial training. And more importantly, if you use black box and white box attack method to attack these robust models, the robust accuracy actually is much higher. It can be as high as like 58%, or for the adversarial interpolation method, the robust accuracy can be as high as 69% if you are doing black box attack, and 68% if you are doing white box attack. So if you don't look at the robust accuracy on the race attack, you may think, for example, this adversarial interpolation method is pretty robust. It's much, much better than the trace method. But if you look at the robust accuracy on the race attack, actually it's not that good. It's no better than the robust accuracy that you can achieve by standard adversarial training. Therefore, we call this model, they somehow overfit the black box attack or white box attack method, but they are not really robust models compared with the model you can obtain from adversarial training or trees. Okay, and based on this observation, we create a leaderboard on our lab's GitHub website. So we call it ADBD, which is average decision boundary distance leaderboard. So we compare all those adversarial training models or adversarial defense models in terms of natural accuracy, robust accuracy, and ADBD. So basically, the larger the ADBD, the more robust the model is. And the smaller the ADBD, the less robust the model is. And through this leaderboard, we can see that the RST method, which is trace plus unlabeled data, is indeed the current best adversarial training method. And our method, which is called MART, I introduced in the first part, is ranked in the third place. And for trace is ranked in the 7th place. And for adversarial training is just next to trace. So you are welcome to provide your robust models or other robust models you think might be robust to our leaderboard, and we are happy to do the test for you. If you don't want to implement anything, you can directly send us the model, and we will do the testing for you. And the goal of this leaderboard is to try to push the research of adversarial training and adversarial defense to come up with real robust models, and somehow identify those norms, because there could be many models that are falsely robust, and we don't want to be misled by these falsely robust models. Okay, so to summarize, in this talk, I basically talk about the 3 things. The first thing is about how to improve the state-of-the-art adversarial training method. And I believe there are many different ways to improve the state-of-the-art adversarial training method. And in our work, we just take approach through the lens of differentiating the misclassified example and the correctly classified example. And it turns out to be very effective. And the second thing I talk about is how to understand the impact of the neural network architecture on adversarial training. So remember that neural network architecture is a very broad topic. It includes the width, the depth, for example, the skip connection, and also, for example, drop out discussed in previous talk. And our work only explored the impact of neural network width on the adversarial robustness. And the key takeaway from this part is we found that if you want to use wider neural network, then you need to increase the robust regularization to unleash the power of wider neural network. Otherwise, you may end up with going with wider neural network, but end up with lower robust accuracy. And in the last part of my talk, I show that by using hard label attack, you may be able to come up with better way to evaluate the robustness of your models. Of course, the white box attack and the black box attack are still important ways to do robust evaluation. But the hard label attack could be a good addition to the white box attack and the black box attack in terms of the robustness evaluation. So that's all I want to share with you in this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the talk. So is there any question? So you can either directly unmute yourself to ask the question, or you can also post on the chat. Yeah, so I think while waiting for other questions, I'll ask my question.
Okay,
so,
thank you.
I think that's so I have a question about the second part. So I think that's really interesting. When you increase the width of the network, you find difference between the generation error and the robust generation. So I wonder. So in your figure, I think the stability. So you have a page 19 maybe.
Okay.
The stability will drop as training goes. So is there any explanation about this? Is it because you are getting away from the random initialization?
Okay, so there are 2 directions. One is the direction along the training epochs. So for this, the job around this direction actually is very easy to understand, because when you do adversarial training, when you do the inner maximization, you are essentially pushing the original example to some position such that the neural network will misclassify that perturbed example. And if it misclassifies the perturbed example, and also it will, and if it correctly classifies the original example, then this will decrease the stability, because stability is defined as the difference between these 2 terms. So along the training epochs, the drop of the stability actually is the consequence of the object function used in the inner maximization. And what I would like to highlight here is around the direction of a neural network width. So we found that if you go with wider neural network, if we are using the same regularization parameter, then the wider the neural network, actually the lower the stability, and also the faster the drop of the stability. And this is the motivation why we would want to alleviate this problem by increase the regularization parameter lambda. Because if you ignore the regularization parameter lambda, that robust accuracy, that robust regularization term will decrease during adversarial training against the epoch very quickly. So we want to add a larger regularization parameter to compensate this decrease. And by doing that, we found that it turns out to be effective. So if we are using larger regularization parameter, then even for wider neural network, we'll be able to achieve higher robust accuracy.
Okay.
Yeah, but I have to say that this part of result is still mostly experimental driven. In theory, we don't have a very concrete or very rigorous explanation yet. And even for this generalized adversarial training, this kind of decomposition, it's just some mathematical thinking that partially explain why you go with larger network, you end up with weaker robust regularization. But we didn't prove it, or we don't know how to prove it yet. Maybe it's a very interesting open problem to study in the future.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So, is there other questions?
I think there's some question in the chat box.
It's about
yeah, there are several requests for getting the slides, but since we didn't collect the slides from the speakers, I would suggest if you are interested in getting the slides, just directly reach out to the speakers. But we will make the recording available on YouTube.
Yeah, I can also send you the slides, and you can post it on the website if you want.
That'll be good. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's thank again, Chen Chen. Thanks for joining and giving this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so next, let me share my screen. Okay, yeah, so we are now at the last part of our workshop that will consist of 2 best paper presentations and also some breakout sessions. And for the breakout sessions, it was meant for those presenters that have the papers accepted at our workshop. So all the pre-recorded videos are already been made available and can be accessed through the KDD virtual portal. So you just log in and find our workshop, and then you can watch the videos. But we still want to use this hour, right, the remaining time of after the best paper presentation to basically have that the presenters of accepted papers has the ability to do some elevator pitch of your work, or even post your own like a Zoom or whatever web meeting sessions to have a discussion with your peers and the attendees. So that's the idea of the breakout session. So I see Jeffrey Penn, who is the first presenter of the Best Paper Award, is online. So Jeffrey, can you share your screen?
All right.
Yeah, so Jeffrey Penn and Nicholas Zufeld is one of our Best Paper Award recipients. Congratulations, and he will give a live presentation and Q&As. Okay, you can take it over.
All right, so as you've heard, I'm Jeffrey Penn from Phillips Academy, Andover, and today I will be presenting my paper on intrinsic dataset properties for adversarial machine learning, joint work I did with Dr. Nicholas Zufeld. So as we all know, adversarial examples present a massive problem for machine learning applications. In this famous example, as you've already seen, this picture of a panda can be misclassified with high accuracy as this picture of a gibbon, only with some slight modification. And then more recently, researchers have also been applying adversarial examples to the real world. So for instance, this t-shirt that fools facial recognition technology. So in order to ensure that neural networks are robust against these sorts of adversarial examples, there's been much work done on adversarial defenses, such as adversarial training and input transformations. However, this existing work has focused a lot on the model and training portions of the machine learning pipeline, but not so much on the data itself. So in this paper, we wanted to tackle this new angle for adversarial machine learning. In particular, we wanted to investigate intrinsic dataset properties, specifically image size and image contrast. And as these properties are model agnostic, any sort of defense that would be built upon these properties would make them ideal for building robust models, as these sorts of techniques could transfer very easily across different types of architectures and across different tasks. So for our first example, for different image sizes, we used 3 different resized images for our data sets. So as you can see, we resized this ImageNet image from the original size, and we cropped it to 112 by 12 and then 56 by 56. For MNIST and CFAR, since the original image sizes are significantly smaller, we scale them both down and up. And for our experiments, we also retrained our neural networks to work best for our resized images. In terms of image contrast, we can generally define this as the change in luminance over the average luminance. Although there are many differing definitions of image contrast, they generally follow this form. From this original image I've shown in the middle, we can generate 2 additional images. So one has had its contrast reduced to half of the original contrast, whereas this image here has twice the original contrast. And as you can see with these higher contrast images, you can see there's generally greater changes within the bright and dark areas of the image, whereas for the lower contrast images, there's less such change. So we have, in our experiments, we've applied 4 popular adversarial attacks in our study: the fast gradient sign method, the basic iterative method, projected gradient descent, and deep fool. Note that these are all white box attacks, but given that we want to study the effects that these dataset properties have, we felt that using these popular white box methods would allow us to better perhaps understand why these dataset properties may play such a role in impacting robustness. In terms of defenses, we've applied 2 compression-based adversarial defenses, which is our total variance minimization and JPEG compression. We chose these defenses specifically because they are model agnostic and are thus suitable for dataset property studies. We decided to move away from these defenses that are more architecture and task specific, given that we are testing across a wide variety of tasks and model architectures. And as we've already mentioned, we ran our experiments on these 5 popular image classification datasets. Our pre-trained models and code are all released on GitHub, and I'll show a link at the end of my presentation. Our MNIST /fashion MNIST models are based on the convolutional neural network proposed in Madri's paper, and our CFAR10 and CFAR100 models are based on the ResNet 18 architecture with modifications made for the smaller input size, while for ImageNet, we directly use the ResNet 18 architecture. And in our training, we apply several data augmentations to boost training accuracy, such as random cropping and random flips. And in our extensive experiments, we include 5 popular image datasets, 4 attacks, and 3 defense methods. And we use 3 different image sizes and 3 image contrasts, as well as 4 different epsilon values to control the maximum image perturbation using the L-infinity norm. So thus, in total, we run over 2,000 combinations for a comprehensive study of these dataset properties. So here are some key results. Through our extensive experiments, we have found that image size and image contrast do indeed affect the performance of adversarial attacks and defenses. And there exists some certain optimal image sizes for adversarial robustness, but it depends on the benchmark or the task. So generally, we found that the image size is a trade-off between too large of an image size and too small of an image size, which you can see later when I go over the detailed results. For simpler benchmarks, smaller image sizes are generally preferred, but when defenses are applied, we find that larger image sizes are more robust. Whereas for image contrast, we generally find that higher image contrast usually leads to increased robustness. So now let me show you some more comprehensive results. So first on different image sizes. So this is a very busy figure, but this shows all of our image size results for the MNIST data set. So each column here represents a different attack method, fast gradient sign method, the basic iterative method, PGDD, and deep fool. Whereas each row shows a different defense strategy, either being no defense, the total variance minimization defense, or JPEG compression. For each of these attack defense combinations, we have 4 different epsilon values here, and the 3 colors represent the 3 different image sizes. The yellow here being the smaller image size of 14 by 14, the green here being the original input size, and the blue being the larger image size. So as you can see on the first row, where no defense is applied, generally smaller image sizes, the yellow, perform better than other image sizes. And given that MNIST is a very simple data set, we believe that this simply may just be that by reducing the image size, there's less possibilities for potential attacks. As we use the L infinite norm, there's simply less pixels for each attack to change within the image, which is thus limiting the effectiveness of each attack. And since MNIST is an easy data set, by downsampling to 14 by 14 images, we don't actually lose that much clean performance. However, once we apply defenses, we actually see the opposite trend is true. So we see that in general, the blue bars, which represent the larger image size of 56 by 56, perform better, although there are some exceptions here when epsilon is very large. And we believe this is kind of indicating a sort of trade-off with an image size, where too large of an image size will give the attack method increased effectiveness, as there's more pixels within the image to change, and thus more potential attack combinations to create a successful misclassification. Whereas if you make an image too small, you're losing a lot of useful features that are useful for clean classification. So that's something that we noted for these compression techniques. With these 14 by 14 images, once you apply compression techniques such as total variance minimization and JPEG compression, we actually find that the robust accuracy drops to below that of even when no defense is applied, meaning that these defenses are doing more harm than good. So there are some exceptions here where when epsilon is very large, and that could be as a larger image size does make an attack more powerful. So with larger epsilons, which allow larger perturbations, simply having more pixels within the image can greatly increase the attack effectiveness. Although generally we see that larger images do indeed perform better when defenses are applied, simply because there's enough pixels within the image such that after compression, there are still useful features so the classifier can accurately classify the images, but the compression techniques are indeed able to remove these sorts of adversarial perturbations. For fashion MNIST, we also see a similar trend. We see that generally smaller image sizes are more robust in this no defense scenario. However, once defenses are applied, the opposite is true. And we do indeed see that in most cases, larger image sizes are better, although there are some exceptions. Interestingly enough, we do actually see in some cases that the opposite trend is true, where, for instance, for this graph, for the PGD JPEG compression combination, when epsilon is very large, we actually see that the smallest input size actually performs the best. And this could, although our results are more experimental, this could again be suggesting that too large of an image size makes attacking significantly easier. And this can be interesting for applications where smaller image sizes are preferred, such as in low power or efficient ML set scenarios. For CFAR10, we actually find that the most robust image size is the original image size in the middle here for the first 3 attacks. And we see that throughout our experiments, we actually find that for deepful, there's no drop in accuracy, interestingly enough, when we increase the epsilon in the defense scenario. So interestingly enough, it seems that this robust accuracy does not seem to be sensitive to the maximum allowed perturbation size, which could potentially suggest that these sorts of compression-based defenses are working equally effectively, regardless of epsilon for the deepful attacks specifically. And given that deepful does work on a different algorithm than these other attacks which are cost function based, that could potentially explain this difference. For CFAR 100, we again see a similar trend where generally the middle input size performs the best, which shows that this sort of sweet spot for each task may depend upon the task. As we see for MNIST and fashion MNIST, we generally see that smaller image sizes are better in this no defense scenario, but for CFAR, which is perhaps a more complicated data set, we thus need a larger image size to allow for clean classification in the first place. For ImageNet, all of our attacks perform very well in this no defense scenario, as you can see from the graphs here. All the accuracy, the robust accuracy of our classifier is below 5% for all of these. So given the effectiveness of these attacks, we try not to draw any conclusion from here, but looking at the defense scenarios, we see that in general, these trends are also true. And we see that higher image sizes indeed lead to higher robustness, especially for ImageNet being the most complicated data set out of all 5 of our data sets. It does show that we do need a larger image size in order to retain features for clean classification. So overall, it seems that the best image size seems to depend on the data set and also the task. So this is an interesting research problem to explore in the future, in that how do we find the optimal image size to use for a certain task. Now we'll show more detailed results on the image contrast. So for the MNIST data set in general, we see that higher contrast does indeed lead to more robustness. And although there are, again, some outliers where when the contrast value is too large, and for very large epsilon values, then too high of a contrast may backfire in these cases over here. For fashion MNIST, again, we also see that higher contrast leads to more robustness. And we see that these trends are actually even more consistent than MNIST. One explanation for why higher contrast may lead to increased robustness could simply be that by increasing the change in luminance values within an image, we get more edges and more distinct features that could be useful for the network in classification. And we see similar trends hold for CFAR 10 over here, CFAR 100, and also for ImageNet. Again, we get very low performance in this no defense scenario, so we don't draw any conclusions from this row. But for TVM and JPEG compression, we also see this general trend that holds true, that more contrast does indeed lead to better results. And interestingly enough, also for the image contrast experiments as well, we find that deepful is also very consistent across these epsilon values, in that when we increase the maximum allowed perturbation, it doesn't actually lead to any drops in the robust accuracy. So this is the first systemic study on dataset properties for adversarial machine learning. So in particular, we investigate the effects of image size and image contrast. And we do indeed find that they can significantly affect the performance. And generally, higher image contrast does lead to increased robustness, while the optimal image size depends on the benchmark in the task. And finally, we find that deep full seems to be pretty consistently defended across the image sizes and contrasts. Given that this is a new research direction, we expect many new research opportunities. So one thing that would be important in the future is how can we quantify the robustness of a certain data set given its original image size and its contrast values and such. More interestingly, we can also explore other intrinsic data set properties, and as a more practical application, how we can design data set preprocessing in a way that keeps in mind the intrinsic properties of a data set and how it affects the robustness. Moreover, as I said near the beginning, since this can lead to, these types of data set properties are model agnostic, we can combine them with other defenses such as adversarial training. And our code and pre-trained models are all released on GitHub, so you can feel free to check it out. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. John Cohn from IBM and Dr. Chris Hull from MIT for their generous support in giving me access to the Satori computing clusters used to carry out experiments in this work. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I think we have time for like a short question, so feel free to unmute yourself and speak up, or you can type your comments and I will read out for you. Yeah, so Jeffrey, I have a question. So maybe you can quickly comment on, so you mentioned the image size matters, right? But we can always rescale the image, right, before we do any training and inference. So do you think that will affect the conclusion?
I think that certainly training on different image sizes will also affect the performance. So I think that given that ideally we want to find an optimal image size for a certain task, that will lead to the best robustness when we apply these sorts of techniques. Keeping in mind that it's this trade-off between too large of an image size will make the image more vulnerable, whereas too small will harm the original performance.
So there's a question from Colton. So what method did you use to select the data or to do downsampling the data?
So we just, I just used a binary interpolation to upscale or downsample the data.
Okay, yeah, so okay, I think that concludes this first best paper presentation. Next, I'm going to play the recorded video by Alexander Levine and Sohail Felzi from University of Maryland, who is also the recipient of the Best Paper Award. And after that, Alexander Levine will host a live Q&A. So I will share my screen and play the video. So let me know if you couldn't hear the sound. Let's see where it is.
Hi, I'm Alex Levine, and today I'm presenting my joint work with Sohail Felzi entitled Deep Partition Aggregation, Provable Defense Against General Poisoning Attacks. So first I want to talk about what a poisoning attack is. So in a poisoning adversarial attack, there's an adversary whose objective is to change the test time behavior of a classifier by making minor changes to the training data of that classifier. So depending on the threat model, this could mean either that the attacker is inserting new training samples into the training set, they're distorting existing training samples, or they could just simply be changing the labels of training samples. And because classifiers are often trained on data that's obtained from the public, so for example from the internet, poisoning attacks represent a real security threat. We want to consider a very general model of data poisoning. So we will describe a general poisoning threat model. In this model, the attacker can insert or remove up to row training images, or samples in general. For example, if row equals 10, if this is our training set, the attacker could remove these 4 samples and insert these 6 new samples. Note that this is a very general model because it can also encompass distortions to training images or label changes. A distortion can simply be represented as the removal of the existing training image followed by the insertion of the distorted version of that training image. And the defense that we're proposing, deep partition aggregation, is a certified defense, in other words, a provable defense against these general poisoning attacks. So the way it works is you first partition the data into several partitions, and you train a neural network classifier on each partition. And if you consider how the poisoning will affect this, note that the number of partitions that could possibly be affected by the poisoning is at most rho. So a single poisoning can't affect multiple partitions. So if there are k partitions, there are therefore k classifiers, so each test sample will be classified k times. In the end, for our final classification, we will take the consensus class, the class that's returned most frequently among these k classifications. Note that at most rho of these base classifications can possibly be affected by the poisoning. Therefore, if the gap between the number of base classifiers returning the top class and the number returning the runner-up class is greater than 2 rho, this guarantees that the poisoning cannot possibly affect the classification. Because if you think about it, in the worst case, the attacker would change row classifications from the top class to the runner-up class. This could reduce the gap by at most 2 rho. So if the gap is greater than 2 rho, then the top class will remain the top class, and therefore the classification is provably robust. This provides a robustness certificate for each sample, which we can calculate by simply determining the gap between the top class and the next class and dividing by 2. A caveat is that the partitioning method itself must be robust, and we will get to that a little bit later. So on MNIST, we can certify at least half of the images in the test set to be robust to 509 of these general poisoning attacks, either insertions or deletions. And on CFAR, we don't do quite as well. We can certify at least half of the images to be robust to 9 poisoning attacks. And because these are certificates, this means that for any possible attacker that could be developed in the future, these results will still apply. To our knowledge, this is the first certified defense against general poisoning attacks. We additionally propose an algorithm for the label flipping threat model called semi-supervised deep partition aggregation. So in this threat model, the attacker can only change the labels of the training data, and so each base classifier, when we train it, has access to the entire clean unlabeled data set. And because each partition has access to this large number of unlabeled training data samples, as well as the small number of labels of the samples assigned to its partition, we can use a semi-supervised learning technique to improve the accuracy of each base classifier. So in particular, we will apply a semi-supervised learning technique that first learns an embedding of the unlabeled training data and then learns a final classifier on top of this embedding using the labels it has. So we can learn the unlabeled embedding once using all of the unlabeled data, and then each partition can learn the final classifier on top of this embedding. And because there are many existing semi-supervised learning techniques that first learn a future embedding using all of the unlabeled data before learning a final classifier using the labeled training data, we can apply one of these techniques out of the box. Note that the embedding itself cannot be affected by the poisoning because in this threat model, the unlabeled data cannot be affected by the poisoning. And by applying an existing semi-supervised learning technique, this leads us to substantially improved base classifier accuracy, which means substantially improved certificates, as well as greater final classification accuracy. So in particular, we used the ROTNet architecture for semi-supervised learning. On MNIST, we can certify at least half of test images to be robust to 675 training sample label flips. And on CFAR, we can certify at least half of images to be robust to 83 training sample label flips. So note that on CFAR, we increased our certificate size from 9 in the general case to 83 in the label flipping semi-supervised case. So one technical issue that I kind of glossed over before is that the partitioning method itself must be robust. And this is a trickier, more subtle issue than it sounds, because if you just do something naive like order the data in some way and then split it equally, a single poisoning instance can actually cause an unbounded number of base classifiers to change their classifications. So for example, if we have our data laid out here in some order, let's say either we just use the order that we were given the data in, or if we just, if we don't expect that to be consistent, we might decide, hey, we'll sort the data first. And then we partition that into equal segments. The problem is, what if some new piece of data comes in here in the middle? When we partition in the same way, now not only is the partition with the new inserted data changed, but every subsequent partition is changed. So this one insertion of a poison sample could potentially change the behavior of a large number of base classifiers because all of their training data has now been modified. So our solution to this is to use a hashing scheme. In particular, let T be our training set and H be a deterministic hash function. Then our K partitions are defined as are each defined as the set of samples such that the value that they hash to is equivalent to I mod k, where I is the index of the partition. So in other words, we take a sample, we compute its hash value, we take that mod k, the resulting value is the index of the partition that we will assign that sample to. So in this case, inserting or removing a sample can only possibly affect the one partition that it's being assigned to. So here we have our partitions. If we add a new sample, it will just add it to whatever partition it gets hashed to. If we remove a sample, it will just remove it from whatever partition it gets hashed to. For semi-supervised DPA, because the samples themselves are clean, we can make some optimizations. So in this case, we can just sort the samples themselves, ignoring the labels, of course, and then divide them equally, taking every kth sample and adding it to each partition. So take the first sample, move it to the first partition, take the second sample, move it to the second partition, etc., and then wrap around every k samples. Because the sorting does not depend on the label, this ensures that a label flip will only affect the one partition that the sample winds up in. So note that this means that one label flip affects one partition, which is better than you would see in the general algorithm, because in the general algorithm we would consider that as an insertion followed by a deletion. Additionally, this gives you a more equal distribution of images, which we demonstrate improves the accuracy of the base classifiers, basically because you don't have some base classifiers that receive only a very small number of training points, so you don't have a few very bad base classifiers. So to compare to some prior work, as far as we are aware, DPA is the first scheme for certified robustness to this general poisoning attack model. For label flipping attacks, there was a previous paper that our paper was inspired by, which is specifically for label flipping attacks and also uses a semi-supervised learning method. So in that case, they learn feature embeddings using the unlabeled data, but then they have a certificate for linear classifier specifically that is robust to a bounded number of label flips. And so they have an analytic lower bound for the number of label flips necessary to change the classification of a linear classifier. On MNIST, our method substantially outperforms theirs for label flipping attacks. Our method, as we reported, is robust to 675 label flips. Theirs is robust to less than 200. Very recently, they updated their paper with results on CFAR 10, and in that case, they are showing better robustness certificates than ours. They're showing around 175 in median, whereas we only got 83. However, when they did this, they used some very recent new developments in semi-supervised learning, specifically SimClear. By incorporating these techniques, we expect that we could also see improved performance in our framework. So if we use SimClear instead of RotNet, we expect to see an improved certificate for ours as well. So there's one technical issue that I'd like to bring up as well, which is the de-randomization of the base classifier models for both DPA and SSDPA. So note that in both algorithms, we rely on the training of each base classifier being a deterministic function of the training set. Otherwise, the model might return a different classification on the same input, on exactly the same training input in two different training runs, despite there being zero change in the training data. And particularly considering the fact that we're using deep neural networks, this is slightly non-trivial. And so to accomplish this, we set random seeds deterministically before training each partition, and we also sort the training data going into each partition prior to training. And this is so that the training is invariant to the order that the training samples are input in. So in particular, because we're using stochastic gradient descent, the initial order matters as well as the random seed. Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we look forward to interacting with you all at the workshop.
Okay, yeah, so Alex, do you want to take over and answer questions?
Sure, yeah. Are there any questions?
Yeah, maybe I can start. So I was curious about your first assumption that there are like K partitions, right? Like, so what kind of machine learning scenario would use that kind of assumption?
So it's not really an assumption; it's a hyperparameter, right? So we can set the number of partitions, you know, and then you know, we can basically set it and tune it for performance, right? And so, for example, we find that on simpler data sets like MNIST, we can use a larger number of partitions, and so we get better robustness results. Whereas for something a little bit more complicated like CFAR, it tends to perform better using fewer partitions.
I see. And you always use non-overlapping partitions. Would the overlapping partitions give you a better performance?
So the issue with overlapping partitions is that if you have an overlapping partition and if there's a poisoning on, on the overlap, then you are now changing multiple classifiers, right? So this would, you would need even greater agreement among your classifiers to get the same certificates, or, a smaller number of poisonings would be able to change the classification even more.
Makes sense. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. Yeah, if not, so Alex, maybe you can tell us about what you plan to do, like in the next steps. Right? Are you trying to make it more scalable or make the bounds tighter?
So as I mentioned in the presentation, one thing that we want to do is to update the results within the semi-supervised method using more modern semi-supervised methods. So the idea here is that, we can, by using semi-supervised methods that can learn on fewer labeled data, we'll get better certificates for the label slipping case.
All right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks, Alex. Yeah. So I think we can move to the next session. That will be the breakout session. But before I still have everyone, I want to thank you again for attending the workshop. I know it's difficult for not to be here physically. So I don't know where you are and what time is it on your local time, but I appreciate your attendance. So last year, while there is a physical meeting, right, we do manage to ask everyone to come up to the stage and give like a 1 minute like elevator pitch of the of your accepted paper, right? In addition to the poster sessions. So this year we couldn't do that because it's very difficult to find a time that every accepted papers presenter is awake. So we decided not to have the elevator pitch this time. But if you watch closely, right, in every recorded video, we do ask the presenters to do a 3-minute summary video, right, before the full time, the 15-minute presentation. So I encourage you, right, to while you are attending the KDD, right, to reach out to our KDD workshop tabs and watch those videos and interact with the accepted paper presenters. And also, I want to use this time to open out the floor for breakout sessions. So I think I would hope this breakout session to be handled in like a organic way. That means I would encourage these accepted papers presenters if you are available online, right? So feel free to unmute yourself and speak up, or even share screens. Let me know if you want to do that. So you can do a quick elevator pitch, and like you can provide your personal web links, so you can have like in-depth discussion with the participants if you want. And we will keep this Zoom room as a kind of like a lobby, right, for people to come in and out of the virtual posters. That's or the virtual discussions. That's I imagine how these things would work. Yeah, okay, so the floors are yours. So feel free to unmute yourself, and if you want to do a quick introduction of yourself, show your works, do an elevator pitch, or you want to provide comments and feedback for our workshop, you are feel free to do so. I also want to mention we certainly will hoping to have a third workshop next year also at KDD, hopefully if everything goes smoothly. Yeah, so please stay tuned by watching our websites or follow our Twitters for the updates of the workshop. So anyone who wants to like share your own works? I see. I heard some voice. Anyone trying to speak?
I think we're taking some time to set up the Zoom meetings.
Okay. Yeah, so Aradha, do you want to like maybe show us what your work on study paper is about?
Sure. So I had the paper, or we had the paper on large step perturbations. Some of my co-authors are also on the chat. And basically the idea was that instead of having a small epsilon that you perturb and that's your adversarial input, there's a setup where the adversary is able to change certain features completely. So for example, the example that we often use is an online store where it's hard to change the item that you're selling, but it's really easy to arbitrarily change the title of this item. And so how do you handle that sort of setup? And so I'll post a link, and still sort of figuring out Zoom.
Okay, yeah, I see
And the password is KDD.
Thank you. Yeah, so for the audience who are interested in knowing more about this work, feel free to join the Zoom, and then you can feel free to come back to this lobby room at any time. Thank you. Anyone else that wants to do a quick elevator pitch of your accepted paper, and maybe share the WebEx link, like web meeting links if you want. Just feel free to go ahead. Yeah, okay, so if not, I will still keep the Zoom meeting open until for like 15 minutes more. So until the official closure time, that is the noon time at the Pacific time. Okay. So in the meantime, feel free to speak up and maybe use the chat board to interact with other attendees. Thank you.